Every Sunday, Jedediah Colter slipped into the last pew before the doors opened and slipped out before anyone could catch his eye. 20 years, he'd buried the same secret behind calloused hands and a silent tongue until the night a folded note appeared beneath his door, written in a hand steadier than his own courage. If you've ever carried a shame, you swore no one would find Stay with Jed's story to the very end. Hit subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Jedediah Colter had buried his father on a Tuesday and gone back to work on a Wednesday because grief in his experience was a luxury that didn't feed cattle. That had been 6 years ago. 6 years of rising before the sun. 6 years of mending fences with hands that had long since stopped feeling the sting of barbed wire. 6 years of standing at the edge of every gathering in Copper Hollow, like a man waiting for permission to belong somewhere he already had a right to be. He didn't ask for much. He didn't want much. He wanted his cattle fed, his water running, and nobody looking at him too closely. Sunday mornings broke that rule. Sunday mornings, the whole town packed itself into the white clapboard church at the center of Copper Hollow, and Jed Colter walked in 10 minutes late, sat in the last pew on the left and left before the final hymn finished ringing. He'd done it every week for 6 years. Nobody asked why. Nobody except Reverend Hale, and even he'd stopped asking after the 3rd year when he realized the only answer he'd ever get was a tip of the hat and a man's back disappearing through the door. This particular Sunday, the Reverend had a guest speaker, a circuit preacher passing through from Helena, and the guest preacher had a habit that Reverend Hale did not. He liked to call on members of the congregation to read scripture aloud. Jed felt it coming the way a man feels weather changing in his knees. The preacher's eyes swept the room searching for volunteers, and Jed did what he always did when danger came looking for him. He went still. He'd learned that from elk stillness was its own kind of hiding. It didn't work on preachers the way it worked on wolves. "You there, in the back." The whole church turned. Jed felt 30 pairs of eyes land on him at once, and every one of them might as well have been a brand pressed to his skin. "Sir, would you do us the honor?" 2nd chapter of Ruth, verse 11. Somebody handed him a Bible. It came down the pew from stranger to stranger, each person passing it along like it weighed nothing until it landed in his hands like a stone. He opened it. He stared at the page. The letters sat there in their neat black rows, and they might as well have been footprints of some animal he'd never hunted, tracks leading nowhere he could follow. The silence stretched. Somebody near the front cleared their throat. A child giggled, then got hushed by a mother's hand. "Take your time, friend," the preacher said, in the gentle voice of a man who had no idea what he was asking. Jed's jaw worked. His thumb pressed hard against the page, as if pressure alone might force the words to rearrange themselves into something he recognized. Nothing. He closed the Bible. "Reckon I'll pass," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. He stood, handed the book back to the man beside him, and walked out of the church in the middle of the service, the door swinging shut behind him, loud enough that he heard it crack against the frame from halfway down the steps. Nobody followed him. Nobody ever did. He untied his horse from the post, swung up into the saddle, and rode for Colter Ridge without looking back once. His father's voice found him on the ride home. It always did on days like this. Amos Colter had been dead 6 years, and the man still had more to say to Jed than most of the living. "You're slow, boy. Always been slow. Ain't your fault. Some men got it, some don't." Jed had been 9 years old the first time his father said those words, standing over him at the kitchen table, with a slate and a piece of chalk, watching Jed's hand shake, trying to make sense of letters that scrambled themselves the moment he looked away. "Put that down. Go feed the stock. Letters ain't for men like us." He'd believed it. For 30 years he'd believed it so completely that he never once tried to prove it wrong. He'd built a whole life around the belief, a ranch that ran on memory and instinct instead of ledgers, deals sealed with a handshake instead of a signature, a world small enough that he never had to hold a piece of paper in front of another living soul. It had worked mostly. Copper Hollow was a small town, and small towns ran on trust as much as paper. But small towns were changing, and trust wasn't worth what it used to be. Otis Pruitt ran the general store the way he ran everything else in his life, loudly and with an audience. Jed came in on Monday for feed and nails, same as he did every week, and Otis had the mail waiting behind the counter, same as always, a thin stack held together with twine. "Got something for you, Colter?" Otis slid it across the counter. "Came up from the land office in Helena." Jed's stomach dropped before his hand even touched it. He picked up the top envelope, turned it over. The paper was heavy official looking, with a seal pressed into red wax at the fold. "Something wrong with your eyes? Or you just admiring the penmanship?" Otis grinned at his own joke, glancing toward two men lingering by the tobacco tins, making sure they'd heard it too. One of the men chuckled. Jed recognized him, Duke Marsh foreman, out at the Whitlock, spread a man built like a barn door and twice as thick. "Maybe he's waiting for someone to read it to him." Duke said, "Not quiet about it at all. Heard tell the mighty Colter can rope a steer blind but can't tell a B from a D." Heat crawled up Jed's neck. He folded the envelope once hard and shoved it into his coat. "Obliged for the mail, Otis," he said, and his voice came out flat and low, the voice he used on spooked horses. He paid for his nails and his feed, and he left the store without looking at Duke Marsh again, though he felt the man's eyes on his back all the way out the door. Outside, he stood by his horse for a long moment, one hand resting on the saddle, not moving. Then he pulled the envelope back out and stared at it. Land office. Those two words he knew. His father had taught him to recognize a handful of things his own name. The word cattle. The word debt, because debt was a word a man needed to fear on sight. But land office folded into whatever sentence sat beneath that wax seal could mean a dozen things, and every one of them was the kind of thing a man needed to understand before it understood him first. He couldn't open it. Not there, not with Duke Marsh's laugh still ringing behind him. He tucked it into his coat and rode home instead, the letter sitting against his chest the whole way, like a coal that hadn't cooled yet. Sarah Langford had been in Copper Hollow 11 weeks, and she had already learned more about the town from its silences than from its conversation. She'd learned, for instance, that Otis Pruitt's store was the place people went to be seen forgiving each other, and the place they went to be quietly cruel while smiling. She'd learned that the Whitlock family owned more of the valley than anyone said aloud, and that most folks' politeness toward Silas Whitlock had less to do with respect and more to do with fear of what he might do to their grazing rights if they weren't careful. And she had learned in the 2 months since she'd stood at the front of a one-room schoolhouse and told 19 children to call her Miss Langford, that the man who sat alone in the back pew of the church every Sunday was the loneliest person she had ever laid eyes on. She hadn't meant to notice him particularly, but she'd been sitting 3 rows ahead of him the Sunday the circuit preacher called on him to read, and she'd turned along with everyone else, and she'd watched something happen to his face that she recognized immediately, because she'd worn that same expression herself, once standing in a parlor in Boston being asked a question she had no honest answer for. It wasn't stupidity on his face. She knew stupidity, and she knew shame, and those were 2 entirely different animals wearing similar skins. What she'd seen on Jedediah Colter's face was a man being asked to hand over a wound he'd spent 30 years keeping hidden. She thought about it all through the walk home. She thought about it while she graded slates by lamplight. She thought about it long enough that by Tuesday evening she'd made up her mind to do something about it, even though she had no earthly idea yet what that something ought to be. The note wasn't planned. That was the truth of it, though. She'd tell herself later that it had been. She was riding back from the Hendricks place where she'd gone to discuss young Thomas Hendricks's reading. The boy was bright, but restless, and his mother worried he'd quit school for ranch work before he finished his letters, and the road home ran past Colter Ridge. She saw him in the far pasture alone, mending a fence line that didn't need a man's full attention, the kind of chore a person did when they needed their hands busy and their mind elsewhere. She didn't stop. She told herself that was cowardice later, but in the moment it felt like manners. But she thought about him the rest of the ride, and by the time she reached the schoolhouse, she'd taken a sheet of paper from her desk and written 6 words on it before she could talk herself out of it. You don't have to hide from letters. She almost tore it up 3 times. She didn't sign it. She told herself that was because a signature would make it improper, a woman leaving notes for a man unmarried and unrelated to her. The truth was closer to fear. If she signed it and he threw it in the fire, she'd know exactly whose foolishness had been rejected. She rode out to Colter Ridge before dawn on Wednesday, folded the note twice, and wedged it into the gap in his gatepost where the wood had split and never been fixed. Then, she rode home before the sun was fully up, her heart going faster than the pace of her horse justified. Jed found it that morning on his way out to check the herd. He almost didn't see it. A scrap of white paper wedged into old split wood, easy to mistake for trash, caught in a fence post. He pulled it free out of habit, more than curiosity unfolded it, and stood there in the gray morning light, staring at 6 words he could not read. He knew it was words. He could see the shapes evenly spaced, deliberate. Somebody had written this on purpose, and left it for him on purpose, and both of those facts sat in his chest like stones. Who would leave him a note? He had no family left to write to him. No sweetheart. No business dealings that required paper, he made sure of that. He turned it over. Nothing on the back, no name. He almost threw it away. His hand actually drew back toward the burn barrel by the barn, the metal drum where he disposed of anything with writing on it, rather than let it sit around collecting dust and questions he couldn't answer. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the careful way the letters were formed, so unlike the scrawled bills and notices he was used to receiving. Maybe it was simple curiosity, a man wondering who in Copper Hollow thought enough of him to write anything down at all. He folded it instead, and put it in his coat pocket next to the land office envelope he still hadn't found the courage to open. 2 pieces of paper, both silent, both demanding something from him he didn't know how to give. The land office envelope sat on his kitchen table for 4 days. He looked at it every morning over coffee. He looked at it every night before bed. On the 5th day, unable to stand it any longer, he saddled his horse and rode into town straight to the one person he trusted enough to ask old Ezra Watts, who ran the livery stable and had known Jed's father since before Jed was born. Ezra had learned his letters late in life too, though not as late as Jed, and he'd never once made Jed feel small for what he lacked. He was also conveniently half-blind these days, which meant he squinted hard at documents and never asked too many questions about why a grown man needed help reading his own mail. "Sit," Ezra said, waving him toward a stool in the tack room, taking the envelope from Jed's hand and holding it at arm's length, then closer, then at arm's length again. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper. His lips moved slightly as he read the way a man reads who learned late and never quite stopped sounding words out in his head. Jed watched his face for a sign before Ezra said a word, the way he'd learned to watch a horse's ears for warning before a storm. Ezra's face didn't give him good news. "Well," Ezra said finally, folding the paper back along its original creases, slow and careful. "This here's from the county land office. Says there's a survey dispute. Water rights. Says a Mr. Silas Whitlock has filed a claim saying the North Creek, the one runs through your upper pasture, was never rightfully deeded to your father. Says Whitlock's got paperwork from before the original survey showing it belongs to Whitlock land." Jed sat very still. "That's near on 1/3 of my grazing," he said quietly. "That creek runs my whole herd through summer." "I know it does. Whitlock's had eyes on my water for years." Jed's hands curled into fists on his knees. "Everybody knows it. Man's tried to buy me out 3 times since Pa died. Well, seems he's found himself a paper way to just take it instead of buy it." Ezra tapped the document. "Says here you got 30 days to respond with your own documentation proving the boundary or the land reverts to whoever's got the—" He squinted at the word again. "Prevailing claim. That's Whitlock, less you can prove otherwise." "My pa never kept much paper." "I know that too." Jed stared at his own hands, work-scarred and useless against an enemy made of ink. "There a way to fight this without paper?" Ezra's face answered before his mouth did. "Son, everything about fighting this is paper. Deeds, surveys, old contracts, letters your pa might have kept proving the boundary line. You're gonna have to go through everything your father left behind, find whatever proves that water's yours, and present it to a county judge in..." He checked the date on the letter, 26 days now since it took a week just getting here. Jed said nothing for a long moment. "And if there's a paper trail," Ezra added gentler now, "you're gonna have to be able to read it. All of it. Judge ain't gonna take kindly to a man standing in his courtroom needing someone to whisper his own evidence into his ear." The words landed exactly where Ezra probably didn't intend them to. Jed stood up so fast, the stool scraped hard against the floor. "Obliged for your time, Ezra." Jed. But he was already out the door, already swinging up onto his horse, already riding hard for Colter Ridge. Like there was something back there he could outrun. There wasn't, of course. There never was. He spent that night tearing through the small trunk his father had left behind, the only place in the house where paper of any kind was kept, because Amos Colter had trusted paper about as much as his son eventually would. Deeds. Letters. A marriage certificate for parents Jed barely remembered. All of it sitting there in black ink, patient and indifferent to the fact that Jed could not read a single line of it. He held up page after page to the lamplight, searching for anything that looked official. Anything with a seal or a map or a boundary line drawn in his father's careless hand. He found a folded paper with what looked like a crude drawing on it. Lines that might have been a creek, might have been anything but. There was writing crowded around the edges of it, and without the writing, the drawing meant nothing at all. He sat on the floor of his father's old room, surrounded by 30 years of paper he could not read, and for the first time since he was 9 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with a slate, Jedediah Colter put his face in his hands and let himself feel exactly how small this made him. He didn't go looking for her. That part he'd insist on later, whenever he told this story, and he would tell it eventually, though, not for a long while yet. He didn't go looking for the schoolteacher. Fate, or foolishness, or something he wasn't ready to name, yet just happened to put her in his path. It happened 3 days after Ezra's warning, on a morning when Jed rode into town for supplies. He didn't much need, mostly, because sitting alone at Colter Ridge with that trunk of unreadable paper had started to feel like drowning in a room with no water in it. He was tying his horse outside the mercantile when he heard children's laughter spill out of the schoolhouse across the road, followed by a woman's voice calm and clear, dismissing them for the noon hour. He watched the children scatter like a covey of quail, and he watched the schoolteacher step out onto the porch behind them, shading her eyes against the sun. And something about the way she stood there, steady, unhurried, watching her students run off into the day, made him stop what he was doing and just look at her a moment longer than was polite. She turned and caught him at it. Jed looked away fast, busying himself with a saddlebag buckle that didn't need adjusting. She crossed the road anyway. "Mr. Colter." Her voice up close was even steadier than it had sounded across the street. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Sarah Langford." "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat, kept his eyes somewhere around her shoulder rather than her face. "Jedediah Colter." "I know. Copper Hollow isn't a large town, Mr. Colter. Most everyone knows everyone else's name." "Reckon that's true." She studied him a moment, and he had the distinct feeling of being read himself the way he imagined a person might feel under the eyes of someone who actually could make sense of what was written on a page. "I wonder," she said, "if I might ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense." His jaw tightened. He had a fair guess what was coming, and every muscle in his body wanted to be back on his horse and gone before she said it. "You can ask. Did you receive a note left at your gate several days back?" So it had been her. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her properly, then for the first time, a woman with steady brown eyes, and no trace of the pity he'd braced himself for, only something that looked closer to patience. "That was you," he said. It wasn't quite a question. It was. "Why?" The question came out harder than he meant it, but she didn't flinch from it. "Because I watched what happened to you in church a few Sundays back. Mr. Colter and I recognized something in your face that I don't believe anyone else in that congregation understood." "Ain't nothing to understand. I just don't much care for reading aloud in front of folks." "That's not what I saw." Jed's hands curled at his sides. "With respect, ma'am, you don't know me well enough to say what you saw." "You're right, I don't." She didn't back down, didn't soften her voice to smooth over his temper, the way most folks did when he got sharp with them. "But I've been teaching children to read for 11 weeks in this town, and I've seen every kind of struggle a person can have with letters, children who mix them up, children who are too proud to ask for help, children who are simply scared of failing in front of their friends. And I recognized every single one of those things on your face that Sunday, Mr. Colter, except you're not a child, and you've had a great deal longer to build a wall around it." The truth of it hit him low in the gut hard enough that for a moment he couldn't find a single word to throw back at her. "I don't need charity," he said finally low. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a skill same as I'd offer anyone. What you do with that offer is entirely your own business." She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, like the conversation had reached its natural end, whether he wanted it to or not. "The schoolhouse sits empty most evenings after supper," she said. 6 o'clock if you ever find yourself curious. No one need know but the two of us." She turned and walked back across the road before he could answer, and Jed stood by his horse for a long time, after she disappeared inside that folded note still sitting in his coat pocket like a stone he couldn't put down. He didn't go. Not that first evening. He told himself it was pride. He told himself it was 30 years of his father's voice telling him letters weren't for men like them. He told himself a dozen things while he sat alone at his kitchen table that night, staring at the unopened trunk of paper in the corner of the room. 23 days now standing between him and a courtroom he had no way to face. He didn't go the second evening either. But the third evening, Duke Marsh rode out to Colter Ridge with a message from Silas Whitlock himself. Friendly on its surface, sharp underneath the way most things that came out of the Whitlock spread tended to be. "Mr. Whitlock wanted you to know," Duke said, not bothering to dismount, looking down at Jed from his saddle with the particular pleasure of a man delivering bad news. He'd been asked to deliver. "He's willing to settle this water business quiet man to man, save you the trouble and expense of a courtroom. Save you the embarrassment too, seeing as how everybody in town already knows you can't hardly read your own name, let alone a legal deed." "That's so. Just needs your signature on a little agreement. Real simple. I could read it to you myself right here, save you the trip to town." Duke smiled slow and mean. "Wouldn't take 5 minutes." Jed stood very still the way he had in church, the way he had his whole life when danger came sniffing around a wound he'd spent decades hiding. "I'll take my chances with the judge," he said. Suit yourself." Duke gathered his reins, still smiling. "Judge is gonna want paper though, Colter. Whitlock's got a whole stack of it. What you got memory and a handshake that ain't gonna hold up against a legal survey and everybody from here to Helena knows it." He rode off laughing, and Jed stood there in his own yard. Humiliation burning hotter in his chest than it ever had before because this time it wasn't just his pride at stake. It was his father's land. It was everything Amos Colter had built with hands that couldn't read either, but had at least had the sense to marry a woman who'd died too young to teach her son what she knew. That night, Jed Colter saddled his horse in the dark and for the first time in his life rode toward the one thing he'd spent 30 years riding away from. The schoolhouse window still had a lamp burning when he got there past 9 o'clock, well beyond any decent hour for calling on a lady. And he almost turned back twice on the ride in. He didn't. He tied his horse, stood on the porch a long moment with his hat in his hands, and knocked. Sarah opened the door, already dressed for bed, beneath a shawl, a book still open on the desk behind her. And if she was surprised to see him standing there at that hour, she didn't show it on her face. "Mr. Colter." "Ma'am, I know it's late. I know I ought to have come at 6 like you said, and I know I got no right showing up at your door this hour of night, but—" He stopped, started again. "I need your help." She stepped back from the door without a word and let him in. He stood in the middle of her small schoolroom, hat still in his hands, feeling every bit as out of place as he had at 9 years old, with a slate in front of him. "Sit down, Mr. Colter," she said, gesturing to a small desk sized for a child, the only humor she allowed herself at his expense. "I'm afraid it's what we've got." He sat, knees jutting out awkwardly beneath the small desk, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "Whitlock's after my water rights," he said finally. "Got some old paper says the creek through my north pasture never rightly belonged to my father. I got 23 days to prove him wrong in front of a county judge, and my whole defense is sitting in a trunk full of my father's papers that I cannot read one single word of." Sarah sat down across from him, folding her hands on the desk, her face serious now, all trace of gentle humor gone. "Then we don't have much time," she said. "No, ma'am, we don't." "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Colter, because I think you deserve honesty more than most. Learning to read, truly read well enough to make sense of legal documents that typically takes months, sometimes years depending on the person." Jed's jaw tightened. "I got 23 days. I know." She held his gaze steadily. "So we won't try to make you a scholar in 23 days. We'll teach you exactly what you need to survive that courtroom, and we'll do it faster and harder than I've ever taught anyone in my life. But I need you to understand something first." "What's that?" "This isn't going to feel good. It's going to feel exactly the way it felt in church that Sunday, worse some days, because we'll be doing it over and over until it finally breaks open. If you're not willing to sit in that feeling, Mr. Colter, we shouldn't start at all, because half-hearted won't save your water rights." Jed looked down at his own hands, work-scarred and strong and completely useless against the thing he was about to face. "My father told me letters weren't for men like us," he said quietly. "Told me that when I was 9 years old, and I built my whole life around believing him." "And what do you believe now?" He was quiet a long moment. "I believe," he said finally, "that I'd rather feel that shame in this room with you than lose everything my father built because I was too proud to ask for help." Something shifted in Sarah's face, not quite a smile, but close to it, the particular satisfaction of a person watching someone choose the harder, better road. "All right then." She reached for a slate and a piece of chalk, sliding it across the desk toward him, the way it might have been slid toward a stranger 30 years earlier. Except this time there was no mockery waiting on the other side of it. "Let's begin with your name." The first lesson lasted 2 hours, and it very nearly broke him. She started simple. The alphabet letter by letter, sounds paired with shapes, the same foundation she'd have given any 6-year-old on their first day of school. Jed's hand, so steady on a branding iron or a length of rope, shook holding the chalk. "It's all right," she said, when his first attempt at his own name came out as a jumble of backward letters and crossed lines. "Try again." "This is foolish." "It isn't. I'm 39 years old sitting at a child's desk trying to spell my own name and failing at it. You're 39 years old learning something you were never given the chance to learn before now. There's no shame in that, Mr. Colter. The shame was in whoever decided you weren't worth teaching." He looked up at her sharply, at that something raw moving behind his eyes. "That was my own father," he said. "Then your father was wrong," Sarah said simply and without hesitation. "And I imagine some part of you has known that for a very long time, even if you've never let yourself say it out loud." Jed said nothing, but his hand steadied just slightly, and when he tried his name again, the letters came out crooked, but recognizable. J-E-D. He stared at it a long moment. "That's—" His voice caught, and he had to clear his throat before he could finish. "That's my name." "That's your name?" Sarah agreed quietly. He didn't cry. Jedediah Colter hadn't cried since he was 9 years old at that kitchen table, and he wasn't about to start now in a child's desk in front of a woman he'd known for less than a week. But something in his chest loosened that had been clenched tight for 30 years, and he sat there staring at 3 crooked letters, like they were the first true thing he'd ever managed to say. They met every night after that, 6 o'clock sharp, and some nights not ending until well past 10. Jed riding home in the dark with his head full of letters and sounds and shapes, 22 days, then 20, then 18, ticking down toward a courtroom he still wasn't sure he'd survive. The lessons were brutal in a way Jed had never expected book learning to be. His hand cramped. His eyes burned from squinting at shapes that refused to hold still in his mind. More than once he slammed the chalk down hard enough to crack it standing up from that too small desk with his jaw tight and his eyes wet with frustration he refused to let fall. "I can't." "You can." "I've tried this same word 4 times, Sarah, and it still don't make a lick of sense to me." It was the first time he'd used her given name. Neither of them remarked on it, though something passed between them in the silence that followed, quiet and unnamed. "Then we try it a 5th time," she said. "And a 6th if we have to. You didn't learn to break a wild horse the first time you sat a saddle, Jed. Why would this be any different?" He looked at her a long moment, breathing hard frustration and something else entirely warring behind his eyes. "Because a horse never made me feel stupid," he said quietly. "This does. Every single night." "You're not stupid." Her voice was firm now, no softness in it at all. "I need you to hear that, and I need you to believe it, because it's going to matter a great deal more than any word we learn in this room. You are a man who was denied something every child deserves, and you have spent 30 years compensating for that denial so well that most people never even noticed. That is not stupidity, Jed. That's survival. And now you're doing the hardest thing a grown man can do, which is admitting the survival isn't good enough anymore and starting over from nothing. That takes more courage than anything I've ever watched anyone do." Jed sat back down slowly. He picked the chalk back up. He tried the word a 5th time. Word got around, the way it always did in a town the size of Copper Hollow. Jed's horse, tied outside the schoolhouse most every evening well past dark, didn't go unnoticed for long. It was Otis Pruitt who said it loudest, of course, leaning across his counter to a cluster of customers on a Saturday morning, while Jed stood not 30 feet away pretending to study a shelf of nails he had no interest in. "School teacher's got herself a new pupil," Otis said, grinning wide. "Grown man, if you can believe it. Wonder what exactly Miss Langford's teaching him out there alone every night past dark." Laughter rippled through the store. Jed's ears burned, but he kept his eyes on the nails, kept his hands still, kept his breathing even, the way he'd trained himself to stay calm around anything that might spook. "Careful, Otis," said one of the other men lower, though not low enough. "Whitlock's got that judge coming down from Helena in a few weeks. Might be Colter's just trying to learn enough to keep from losing his whole spread. Man's desperate is all." "Desperate men do foolish things," Otis said. "Wouldn't be the first fella to lose his head over a pretty face while his ranch burns down around him." Jed set down the box of nails he'd been holding harder than he meant to, the sound sharp enough that the whole store went quiet and every eye turned toward him. "Say what you got to say to my face, Otis," he said, his voice low and even. "Or don't say it at all." Nobody said anything else. Jed paid for what little he'd actually come for and walked out without looking at any of them, jaw tight. The whole ride home, Otis's laughter still ringing in his ears no matter how far he rode. He almost quit that night. He sat in his kitchen with the trunk of paper still open in the corner, 17 days left, and told himself the whole thing was a fool's errand, the reading, the lessons, all of it. Told himself he'd rather lose the water rights than let the whole town keep laughing at him while he tried and failed to become something he wasn't. He didn't go to the schoolhouse that evening. Sarah didn't come looking for him, not that night. but the following morning he found another note wedged into the same split fence post where the first one had appeared, and this one wasn't unsigned. A man doesn't stop learning to read because a fool laughed at him for trying. He stops because he decided the fool was right. Don't decide that, Jed. S.L. He read it himself. Slowly, sounding out each word the way she'd taught him, his lips moving silently. And when he finished, he stood in his own yard holding that scrap of paper like it was the most important document he'd ever held in his life. More important in that moment than any deed or survey sitting in that trunk. He saddled his horse and rode into town that evening, same as always, 6 o'clock sharp. "You came back?" Sarah said when he walked through the schoolhouse door. "Almost didn't." "I know. I heard about Otis Pruitt's store. Small town. The smallest." She gestured him toward the desk. "Sit down, Jed. We've got 16 days and a whole document to make sense of before the judge arrives. Otis Pruitt's opinion of how you spend your evenings isn't worth another minute of your time, and it certainly isn't worth your water rights." He sat. "Why do you care so much?" he said, after a moment, watching her lay out the papers from his father's trunk across the desk between them. "Whether I win this fight or not, you got no stake in Colter Ridge, no stake in me." Sarah paused, her hand resting flat on one of the old documents, and for the first time since he'd known her, something like hesitation crossed her face. "I left Boston," she said slowly, "because a man decided he knew better than I did what I was capable of. My father actually, and the gentleman he'd arranged for me to marry, both equally certain that a woman's mind was a delicate, limited thing, best kept small and quiet and grateful. I spent 26 years being told what I could and couldn't understand, Jed, by men who never once bothered to test whether it was true." Her eyes came up to meet his, steady and fierce in a way he hadn't seen from her before. "So when I watch this town decide that you're less of a man because you never had the chance to learn something the rest of them take for granted, when I watch Otis Pruitt and Silas Whitlock and every small cruel person in Copper Hollow treat you like you're somehow lesser for it, I recognize exactly what that is. And I refuse to stand by and watch it happen to another person, not while I have breath in my body and the ability to do something about it." Jed sat very still, absorbing that something in his chest, shifting in a way he didn't fully have words for yet. "That took courage," he said finally. "Leaving Boston. Leaving all that behind." "It did. And it very nearly broke me some days being that alone in a place I'd never seen with no one who knew me at all." She held his gaze a moment longer. "So no, Jed. I don't have a stake in Colter Ridge, and I never met your father, and I owe you nothing at all. But I know exactly what it costs to fight for the right to be seen as capable, and I am not about to let you fight that battle alone if I have any power to stand beside you in it." Neither of them said anything for a long moment after that. Then Jed picked up his father's document, squinted at the first crowded line of ink, and began slowly to sound out the words. The lessons changed after that night. Something between them had shifted quiet and unspoken, and though neither of them named it, it showed in small ways in how she no longer stood back at arm's length while he struggled, but pulled her chair around beside his, so their shoulders nearly touched over the paper. In how he stopped leaving the moment the lesson ended, lingering instead at the door, with his hat in his hands, searching for some excuse to stay another few minutes. 12 days before the hearing, they made their first real breakthrough on his father's papers. Buried in the trunk beneath deeds and letters Jed still couldn't fully parse, they found a hand-drawn survey map, old and creased soft with age. His father's rough handwriting, labeling the boundary lines in ink gone brown with time. "Jed." Sarah's voice had gone sharp with excitement. "Look at this." He leaned over the map, following her finger, as she traced a line running along what was unmistakably the North Creek. His creek, the one Whitlock claimed, had never belonged to Colter land at all. "That's dated," she said. 11 years before Whitlock's survey. If this is authentic, if a judge accepts your father's original claim as prior, this could be everything we need." Jed stared at the fragile old paper, his father's handwriting still visible on it after all these years, and felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. He kept this. Jed said quietly. All these years. Never told me. Never showed me. Maybe he meant to, Sarah said gently. Maybe he ran out of time. Jed's throat tightened. He thought of his father at that kitchen table telling a 9-year-old boy that letters weren't for men like them, and he wondered for the first time in 30 years whether that had been less about what his father believed and more about what his father had been too afraid, or too proud, or simply too worn down by his own hard life to ever try to fix. I got 11 days, Jed said, to learn to read this whole thing well enough to stand in front of a judge and defend it myself. Sarah looked at him steadily. Then we'd better not waste another minute of them, she said, and pulled her chair closer still. They worked past midnight most nights. After that, the schoolhouse lamp burning long after the rest of Copper Hollow had gone dark and quiet around them. Jed's reading came faster than either of them had dared hope not, because the shame disappeared, but because he'd found something stronger than shame to push against it. His father's own hand reaching across 11 years, offering him one last piece of proof that Amos Colter had, in his own broken and imperfect way, tried. Word of the courtroom date spread through Copper Hollow, the way everything did, and with it spread the certainty among most of the town of exactly how it would end. Silas Whitlock had money and lawyers, and a survey drawn up proper by men paid well to draw it his way. Jed Colter had a trunk full of old paper and a school teacher's evening lessons, and to most folks in town, that didn't sound like much of a fight at all. But on the 9th night before the hearing, Jed Colter sat in a child's desk in an empty schoolhouse and read slowly, haltingly, but read out loud from start to finish the full text of his father's original land claim, the very document that would either save Colter Ridge or lose it forever. When he finished, he sat back breathing hard and looked up to find Sarah watching him with an expression he'd never once seen on another living soul's face when they looked at him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't surprise. It was something closer to pride. You did it, she said quietly. We did it, Jed said, and for the first time since he was 9 years old, the words came out of him without a single trace of shame. Sarah didn't let the moment sit for long. She let him have it one full breath of pride, his own name, and his father's claim finally alive in his mouth instead of buried in his throat. And then she reached across the desk and turned the paper back around to face him. Read it again, she said. Sarah, I know what you just did. Read it again. Start to finish without stopping this time. A judge won't care that you did it once by lamplight with me sitting beside you. He'll care whether you can do it standing alone in a courtroom full of men waiting for you to fail. Jed looked at her for a long moment, something between exasperation and admiration moving across his face, and picked the paper back up. He read it again. Slower in places, faster in others, stumbling twice over words that had given him trouble all week, but he got through it start to finish, and when he set the paper down this time, there was no shaking in his hand at all. Better, Sarah said. Better. Jed agreed. Not good. Good is for men who've had 30 years to practice. You've had 10 days. Better is a miracle Jed and you ought to let yourself feel it as one just for tonight. He almost smiled. It was a rare enough thing on his face that Sarah found herself watching for it the way a person watches weather break after a long dry spell. 10 days left, he said. 9 once the sun comes up. Feels like both nothing and forever. That's exactly what it is, Sarah said, and began gathering the papers into a careful stack, squaring their edges against the desk. Now, go home and sleep, Mr. Colter. Tomorrow, we start on the parts of this that worry me more than your reading does. Jed paused at the door hat in hand. What worries you more than my reading? Sarah didn't look up from the papers. Whitlock isn't going to fight fair. A man who tries to steal water from a family for years doesn't stop being ruthless just because his opponent learned his letters. She was right to worry. She just didn't yet know how right. Ezra Watts found Jed at the livery 2 mornings later, and the old man's face carried none of its usual easy humor. Got some news you ain't gonna like. Ezra said, keeping his voice low, even though the stable was empty, but for the two of them and a half-dozen dozing horses. Whitlock's brought in a lawyer. Fella name of Cyrus Beadle come up special from Helena. Word is he's argued in front of near every judge in the territory and won more than he's lost. Jed's stomach tightened. A lawyer's just a man who talks fancy about paper. Maybe so, but there's more. Ezra glanced toward the open stable door, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Judge coming down to hear the case, Harlan Voss. He's stayed out at the Whitlock spread before. Hunting trip 2 summers back. Whitlock hosted him proper from what I hear. Best whiskey, best horses, 3 days of it. You're telling me the judge and Whitlock are friendly. I'm telling you what I heard. Might mean nothing. Judges are supposed to leave that kind of thing at the door. Ezra's face said he didn't much believe his own words. But you ought to know what you're walking into, son. This ain't just gonna be about who can read a piece of paper the loudest. It's gonna be about who the judge already trusts before either one of you says a word. Jed stood very still, the old dread from church settling back into his chest, except now it had grown teeth. Then I reckon I better make sure my paper's stronger than his friendship, he said finally. That's the spirit. Ezra clapped him on the shoulder. Don't tell that schoolteacher I said any of this, mind. Woman's already got enough weight on her without me adding worry to it. But Jed told her anyway that same evening, because he'd already learned in 10 short days that carrying things alone had never once made him stronger, only lonelier. Sarah's face went tight and thoughtful as he laid it out, and when he finished, she was quiet long enough that he started to regret telling her at all. Then we don't just need your father's map, she said finally. We need more than one piece of proof. Something a friendly judge can't wave away without looking corrupt in front of a room full of witnesses. Where in God's name am I supposed to find more proof I already tore through everything my father left? Then we look somewhere he didn't. Sarah stood already moving toward the small shelf where she kept the town's few records she'd borrowed for her students' history lessons. Church registries, tax rolls, anyone still living who remembers where that creek ran before either of our families set foot in this valley. Jed watched her move with a kind of fierce, focused purpose that struck something loose in his chest. Not pity, not gratitude exactly. Something closer to the beginning of a feeling he didn't yet have a name for, and wasn't at all sure he was allowed to. The trouble came from a direction neither of them expected. Cornelius Datchet ran the Copper Hollow School Board, the way he ran his mercantile ledgers, with an eye fixed firmly on whatever kept the largest depositors happiest, and Silas Whitlock had been the largest depositor in Datchet's bank for going on 9 years. He came to the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon while children still lingered over their slates and waited with visible impatience until the last of them had filed out before he spoke. Miss Langford, a word. Of course, Mr. Datchet. Sarah closed the door behind the final student and turned to face him, already reading something unpleasant in the set of his mouth. It's come to the board's attention. Datchet began, in the tone of a man who'd rehearsed his opening, that you've been entertaining a gentleman caller here in the schoolhouse. Alone. Well past proper hours. Sarah's spine straightened. I've been teaching an adult student to read, Mr. Datchet. Mr. Colter has a legal matter requiring literacy he was never given the chance to acquire as a child. I fail to see the impropriety. An unmarried woman and an unmarried man alone in a building after dark several nights a week for the better part of 2 weeks. I'd think the impropriety speaks for itself. Then perhaps the board ought to spend less time speaking about it and more time considering why a man in this town reached 39 years old without ever once being taught his letters. Datchet's face reddened. Watch your tone, Miss Langford. The board employs you at its pleasure, and it can just as easily unemploy you. There are proprieties expected of a schoolteacher in this town, and you would do well to remember it. I remember it perfectly well. Sarah's voice didn't rise, but something in it went hard as flint. I also remember that nothing in my contract, nor in any decent code of conduct, forbids a teacher from teaching. If the board wishes to dismiss me for the offense of doing my job too thoroughly, I'd welcome the chance to say so plainly in front of every parent in this town and let them decide for themselves whether that's a fair reason. For a moment, Datchet looked almost startled by her refusal to shrink. Then his mouth thinned into something colder. "The board meets in 1 week," he said. "I'd suggest you consider your position between now and then, Miss Langford. Mr. Whitlock has been a generous friend to this school. Generous friends have a way of becoming less generous when they're displeased." He left without another word, and Sarah stood alone in the empty schoolhouse for a long moment. Afterward, her hands trembling slightly, with an anger she hadn't let herself show, in front of him. She didn't tell Jed. Not that evening, not the next. She told herself it was because she didn't want to distract him from the reading, with 9 days narrowing toward 8, then 7. The truth sat closer to something else, a stubborn refusal to let herself become one more burden on a man already carrying more than his share. But Jed had spent 30 years learning to read rooms, even when he couldn't read pages. And by the third evening, he set down the paper he'd been working through and looked at her directly. "Something's wrong." "I'm fine. Sarah." Just her name, quiet, and something in the way he said it made her realize how far they'd come from the woman and the near stranger who'd stood on opposite sides of a dusty road 3 weeks ago. She told him. All of it Datchet's visit, the threat, the board meeting hanging over her like a blade. Jed's face went hard in a way she hadn't seen before, not even the night Duke Marsh had mocked him outside the general store. "This is because of me." "It's because of Whitlock. There's a difference." "Is there?" Jed stood, paced the small width of the schoolroom, once, twice, his jaw tight. "You could lose your position, your whole life here, because you were fool enough to help a man who couldn't even read his own name a month ago. Don't." Sarah's voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough that he stopped mid-pace. "Don't you dare stand there and call yourself a burden to me, Jedediah Colter, as if I'm some fragile thing that wandered into your trouble by accident. I chose this. I chose you. I chose to teach you. I mean," she corrected too fast, color rising in her cheeks, "and I will not have you deciding on my behalf what risks are worth taking with my own life. I won't let you lose everything you built here because of my fight. It stopped being only your fight the moment I left that first note at your gate." She stepped closer, refusing to let him retreat into the same stubborn silence that had cost him 30 years already. "I have spent my whole life being told what I was and wasn't strong enough to bear. I left an entire life behind in Boston rather than keep hearing it. I will not hear it now from you of all people." Jed went very still. "What life?" he said quietly. "Did you leave behind in Boston?" Sarah's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked like a woman caught somewhere she hadn't meant to go. "That's a story for another night," she said finally, and turned back toward the desk before he could press further. "We have 7 days, Jed. Sit down. We're not finished." He sat. But he didn't stop watching her, and something in him filed the question away, unanswered, waiting. "Jedediah." The letter arrived 2 days later, and Sarah recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she'd even fully drawn it from the mail sack Otis Pruitt handed across his counter. She didn't open it in the store. She walked it back to the schoolhouse. First sat alone at her own desk for a long while, before she finally broke the seal, and when she finished reading it, her hands were not steady at all. "My dear Sarah, it has been some months now since your abrupt departure, and I confess my patience wears thin. Your father grows unwell and asks after you daily. I have kept your absence from society as discreetly as I am able, but a man cannot indefinitely explain the disappearance of his intended bride to a schoolhouse in some frontier territory without inviting talk that reflects poorly upon us both. I am prepared to forgive this episode and welcome you home provided you return before autumn. I trust you will not make me wait indefinitely, nor make your father's final years harder than they need be. Your obedient servant and I hope still, your intended Nathaniel Ashford." Sarah sat with the letter a long time after reading it, her jaw tight, her eyes burning with something that was equal parts grief and fury. Jed found her still sitting there when he arrived for the evening's lesson. The letter folded on the desk in front of her face pale in the lamplight. "Sarah." She looked up, and for the first time since he'd known her, he watched her struggle to compose herself before she spoke. "It's nothing," she said, which they both knew for a lie the moment it left her mouth. "Doesn't look like nothing." She was quiet a long moment. Then slowly she pushed the letter across the desk toward him. "I told you there was a story from Boston," she said. "I suppose you'd better hear the rest of it now." Jed picked up the letter, and though his reading was still slow, still halting in places, he made his way through it, his face darkening with every line. "He calls you an episode," Jed said when he finished, his voice low and rough. "That's Nathaniel, efficient with his cruelty. He learned it from my father." Sarah folded her hands tightly in her lap. "I was engaged to him for 2 years, Jed. A good match, everyone said, his family's shipping fortune, my father's standing a union that made perfect sense on paper and meant nothing at all in truth. I tried for a long while to convince myself that was enough. What changed? I asked him once what he thought I might do after we married. Whether I might keep teaching in some capacity, a charity school, perhaps something small." Sarah's voice went flat, remembering. He laughed. Not unkindly, he'd have said, just amused. Told me a wife of his stature had no need to trouble herself with other people's children when she'd have her own household to manage. Told me the very idea was sweet, in the way you'd say a child's ambition to become a queen was sweet. Jed said nothing, but his hands had curled slightly on the desk. "I left 3 weeks before the wedding," Sarah continued. "Took what money I'd saved from years of piano lessons I gave in secret, bought a train ticket west, and told no one where I was going until I'd already gone. My father hasn't forgiven me. I doubt he ever will. And Nathaniel," she gestured at the letter, "apparently still believes I'll come crawling back once I've had my fill of frontier foolishness. Will you?" The question came out rougher than Jed intended, and he watched something flicker across Sarah's face at the bluntness of it. "No," she said, quiet, but absolutely certain. "I would rather teach in a one-room schoolhouse in the middle of nowhere, answering to no one's permission but my own, than spend the rest of my life being someone's sweet, amusing idea of a wife." Something eased in Jed's chest at that, though he couldn't have said exactly why it mattered to him as much as it did. "Your father's unwell," he said instead. "That true you figure, or just something Ashford's using to pull you back?" "I don't know." For the first time, real grief cracked through Sarah's composure. "That's the cruelty of it. I don't know if my father is truly ill or if Nathaniel simply found the one lever guaranteed to move me. Either way, I can't go back to find out, not now, not with the board meeting in 5 days and your hearing in 7, and every part of me needed here." Jed reached across the small desk, and for the first time since they'd begun this strange, difficult partnership, he covered her hand with his own. "You don't have to choose alone," he said. "Whatever comes. You taught me that much yourself." Sarah looked down at his hand over hers, work-scarred and steady, and didn't pull away. They didn't have long to sit with that particular tenderness. Jed rode home that night later than usual, his mind still full of Sarah's letter of Boston and Ashford, and a father who might or might not be dying 2,000 miles east, and he never once noticed the fresh hoofprints cutting across his own yard until he was nearly at the barn door. The trunk was gone, not moved. Gone. The room ransacked the floor, littered with papers that had been left behind because they weren't worth stealing, and in the ashes of his own hearth, still faintly warm, the unmistakable curled black remains of what had once been paper. Jed stood in the doorway of his father's old room for a long moment, unable to make his legs carry him further inside. Then he was on his knees at the hearth, pulling burnt fragments toward himself with shaking hands, searching desperately for any scrap of the map that might have survived. He found one corner. A single corner, the ink smeared and half consumed by fire. The boundary line his father had drawn burned away entirely. Nothing left but a jagged edge of paper and the ghost of what had once been proof. No. The word tore out of him raw and broken. No, no, no. He searched the rest of the ashes until his hands were black with soot and his knuckles bled from scraping against the hearthstones, and found nothing else. The deed. The map. 11 days of work. His father's own hand reaching across a decade to save him all of it, gone to smoke in the space of a single evening, while he'd been 3 miles away, holding a schoolteacher's hand and talking about Boston. He rode for town that same night. Fury and grief driving him harder than sense should have allowed, and found Duke Marsh exactly where he expected, drinking at the saloon, with 2 other Whitlock hands, laughing at something that died the moment Jed shoved through the door. "Where is it?" Jed said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Where's what Colter—" Duke's grin was slow, insolent, entirely too satisfied for a man being asked nothing at all. "My father's papers. My deed. You know exactly what I'm talking about." "Can't imagine what you mean." Duke turned back to his whiskey unbothered. "Maybe you misplaced 'em. Seems the kind of mistake a man makes when he's spending all his evenings somewhere other than tending his own house." Jed crossed the room in 3 strides and had Duke by the collar before either of them fully registered it happening, hauling the bigger man half off his stool. "You burned it," Jed said, low and shaking. "You took what belonged to my father and you burned it, and you're going to stand there and grin at me about it." "Careful, Colter." Duke's grin never wavered, even with Jed's fist knotted in his shirt. "Man goes accusing folks of crimes he can't prove with witnesses standing right here to hear him do it. That's a fine way to end up in worse trouble than a water dispute. Especially a man who, last I heard, still ain't too clear on which end of a warrant is his own name." The room had gone silent around them, every eye fixed on the 2 men, and Jed felt the old shame rear up alongside the fury. The reminder delivered exactly where it would cut deepest, that even now, even after everything, there were still men in this town who believed his ignorance made him powerless. He let go of Duke's collar, slowly breathing hard. "This isn't finished," Jed said. "Reckon it might be, though," Duke said, straightening his shirt with exaggerated care. "Seems to me a man without paper don't have much of a fight left in him at all." Jed walked out of the saloon into the cold night air, and for the first time since he'd started this whole desperate endeavor, he genuinely did not know if he had the strength left to keep going. He didn't go to the schoolhouse the next evening. Sarah waited until 7:30, then until 8. The lamp burning low, a familiar dread building in her chest that had nothing to do with her own troubles and everything to do with the empty desk across from hers. She rode out to Colter Ridge herself, propriety be damned, and found Jed sitting alone on the porch steps in the dark, not even a lamp lit inside the house behind him. "Jed, go home, Sarah." His voice came out hollow, defeated in a way she'd never once heard from him, not even that first Sunday in church. "Ain't no use in more lessons now. It's over." She dismounted anyway, walked up the steps, and sat down beside him without asking permission. "Tell me what happened," he told her. The trunk, the fire, Duke Marsh's grin in the saloon. Every word came out of him low and defeated, and by the time he finished his hands were shaking again, though this time from grief rather than rage. "Everything my father left. Gone. 11 days of work gone because I was fool enough to leave it in an empty house while I went off chasing letters like some kind of—" "Don't!" Sarah's voice cut through the darkness, sharp enough to stop him. "Don't you dare finish that sentence with something cruel about yourself, Jed Colter. Not after everything I've watched you fight through to get here. They took it because they knew exactly where I'd be, Sarah. Because everybody in this town knows my whole schedule now thanks to Otis Pruitt's big mouth. This is my fault. It's Whitlock's fault. And Duke Marsh's. You did not burn your own father's map, Jed. A cruel, frightened man did that because he is losing this fight and he knows it." "Losing." Jed laughed bitter and hollow. "Sarah, I got nothing left. No deed, no map. 6 days till I stand in front of a judge who already favors the other side, and not one scrap of paper to prove my family ever had a right to that water at all. Then we find something else. There is nothing else. The words tore out of him louder than he meant, and he stood abruptly pacing away from her into the dark yard. I told you from the start my father never kept much paper. That map was the only thing. It's gone. It's over, Sarah, and I think... His voice caught raw. I think it's best you stop coming out here. Best you go back to worrying about your own troubles instead of mine. Whitlock already threatened your position over this. I won't be the reason you lose everything you built here, too. Sarah stood slowly and walked to where he stood in the dark. Look at me, she said. He didn't at first. She reached up and turned his face toward hers with a gentleness that undid something in him faster than any argument could have. You do not get to decide alone in the dark on your own porch steps that I am better off without you in my life, she said. I have spent my entire life having men decide for me what I could bear and what I couldn't. I will not have it from you, too. Do you understand me? I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protecting. I need a partner who trusts me enough to let me choose my own risks. Her voice softened just slightly. 6 days isn't nothing, Jed. It's 6 more days than you had an hour ago before you decided to give up. Your father may not have kept much paper, but he wasn't the only living soul who remembers where that creek used to run. Jed went still. What are you saying? I'm saying Ezra Watts has lived in this valley longer than either of us has been alive. I'm saying there are old-timers scattered across this territory who might remember your father staking that claim with their own eyes long before any survey was ever drawn on paper. I'm saying a judge who won't trust a burned map might still trust the sworn word of enough honest witnesses standing in a row. She held his gaze steady in the dark. We are not finished, Jed Colter. Not unless you decide we are. And I don't believe not for one single moment that the man I've watched fight his way through 11 days of shame to read his own father's handwriting is a man who quits now. Yet Samim Kupigati Piswans. Jed stood there a long moment, something rebuilding itself behind his eyes piece by slow piece. 6 days, he said finally. 6 days, Sarah agreed. Starting tonight, saddle up, Mr. Colter. We're going to see Ezra Watts. So, Ezra listened to the whole story, with his jaw set tight, and when they finished, he didn't hesitate. Widow Hutchins, he said. Been in this valley near 60 years. Lived up near the North Creek herself, back before your daddy ever bought that land, Jed. If anybody remembers where that water rightly ran before any surveyor came through with his fancy instruments, it's her. She's still living, Jed asked. Living and sharp as a tack, though her legs ain't what they used to be. Runs a little place 2 hours north past Miller's Crossing. 2 hours there, 2 hours back, Sarah said, already calculating. We could ride out at first light, be back well before dark. There's more, Ezra said, and something in his voice made both of them go quiet. Old Tom Reardon, surveyor's assistant on the original county survey 40 years back, before Whitlock's people ever drew up their version. Man's near 80, now lives out past the Whitlock spread itself, if you can believe the irony of it. If Reardon's memory holds and he's willing to swear to it in front of a judge, that's testimony straight from the man who helped draw the very first boundary lines in this valley. Would he do it? Jed asked. Man's neighbor to Whitlock. Might not want the trouble. Might not, Ezra admitted. But Tom Reardon never did care much for Silas Whitlock, not since Whitlock tried buying out his own grazing rights some years back and got refused. Man's got a stubborn streak a mile wide, worth the ride to ask him plain. Sarah was already on her feet. Then we split the days we have left. Widow Hutchins first thing tomorrow. Tom Reardon the day after. And if neither one agrees to testify? Jed asked quietly. Sarah looked at him steady and unflinching even now. Then we'll have tried everything within our power, and we'll walk into that courtroom with whatever truth we can still carry, she said. But I don't intend to find out we failed before we've even asked Jed. Not while there's still time on the clock. Sam. Widow Hutchins turned out to be a small, fierce woman with silver hair pinned severely back and eyes that missed nothing, and she remembered Amos Colter the moment Jed said his father's name. Amos Colter. She said it like tasting an old memory. Big fella quiet, kept mostly to himself. Used to water his herd right along that North Creek summer after summer, long before the Whitlocks ever set foot in this valley with their fancy surveyors and their fancier lawyers. Ma'am, would you be willing to say that in front of a judge? Jed asked, his voice careful, hopeful, in a way he was almost afraid to let show. In 6 days' time in the county courthouse, under oath. Widow Hutchins studied him a long moment, then Sarah beside him, and something in her face softened. You're Amos's boy, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. He was a good man, whatever else folks might say about him now that he ain't around to speak for himself. I'll come, she said with the flat finality of a woman who'd made up her mind decades ago about most things, and rarely changed course. Silas Whitlock's daddy tried to claim that same stretch of water back when I was a younger woman and got told plain by every soul living along that creek that it wasn't his. Seems the son's just as greedy and just as wrong as the father was. Jed felt something loosen in his chest for the first time since the fire, a thread of hope thin but undeniably real. Tom Reardon proved harder to convince, gruff and suspicious at first, wary of any trouble that might come from crossing his powerful neighbor. But Sarah spoke to him with a patience and directness that slowly wore down his resistance, and by the time they left his small cabin, he'd agreed reluctantly to appear. 2 witnesses, Sarah said on the ride back, the sun already beginning to lower over the ridgeline. It's not the map, Jed, but it's something. It's sworn testimony from 2 people with no reason to lie for you and every reason to know the truth. It might not be enough. It might not, Sarah agreed. But it's more than we had yesterday, and it's more than Whitlock thinks we have at all. That alone might be worth something in that courtroom. The confrontation came the day before the board meeting, and Silas Whitlock came himself, this time riding out to Colter Ridge at midday, with an ease that suggested a man entirely confident in his own victory. He didn't dismount. He sat his horse at the edge of Jed's yard, looking down with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed the outcome already settled and waited for Jed to come out to meet him. Colter. Whitlock's voice carried the same false warmth Jed remembered from years of small dealings between them back before any of this began. Heard tell you've been out visiting old Widow Hutchins. Tom Reardon too, I understand. Man works hard chasing ghosts. They ain't ghosts. They're witnesses. Witnesses to what exactly? An old woman's fond memory and a bitter old surveyor's grudge against me. Whitlock shook his head slowly. That's a thin thread to hang a whole ranch on, son. We'll let the judge decide how thin it is. We could settle this today, you know. Right here, right now, no need for either of us to trouble that courtroom at all. Whitlock's smile never wavered. I'd even be generous about it. Full market price for the disputed acreage, more than fair considering the water rights alone are worth double that to a man in my position. You could pay off whatever debts your daddy left, buy yourself a smaller spread somewhere. The water ain't in question at all. Simpler life. No more shame about reading contracts you can't quite trust yourself to understand. I understand this contract just fine, Jed said, his voice steady in a way it wouldn't have been a month ago. I read every word of your last offer myself. Wasn't generous. Was theft dressed up polite. Something flickered across Whitlock's face, the first real crack in his composure Jed had seen since the man arrived. You've been busy, Whitlock said, quieter now. Been busy learning what my father should have been given the chance to teach me himself, if life had been kinder to him. Same as I mean to keep learning long after this water dispute's settled one way or the other. Whitlock's eyes narrowed slightly. There's other ways to settle a matter besides a courtroom, Colter. I've got friends on that school board. Heard your little teacher's had some trouble lately, hasn't she? Talk of impropriety. Talk of dismissal. His voice dropped deliberately soft, deliberately cruel. Be a shame if that talk turned into something more permanent. A woman alone, no family out here, no position, hard thing for a lady to weather in a territory like this. Jed went very still. Something cold and furious settling into his chest. You leave her out of this. I would, Whitlock said, almost gently, if you'd leave my creek out of it. Withdraw your claim, Colter. Take the money. Save the schoolteacher her position, and save yourself the humiliation of standing up in front of the whole county tomorrow, well, the day after, and losing anyway in front of everyone who already expects you to. Jed stepped closer to Whitlock's horse, close enough that the animal shifted uneasily beneath its rider. I'll see you in court, Whitlock, he said low and even. And you can threaten Sarah Langford's position all you like, but I promise you this, whatever happens to that water, the whole valley's gonna know exactly what kind of man you are by the time this is finished. That's one truth no lawyer of yours is gonna talk a judge out of believing. Whitlock held his gaze a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes. Your funeral, Colter, he said finally, and turned his horse riding off without another word. Jed stood alone in his yard a long time after the dust settled, fists still clenched fear and fury, and something that felt almost like pride warring in his chest all at once. The board meeting convened the following evening in the same schoolhouse where Sarah had taught Jed his letters. The small room packed uncomfortably full with half the adults in Copper Hollow crowded onto benches meant for children. Cornelius Datchet called the meeting to order with visible relish, laying out the accusation of impropriety in careful damning language, and Sarah sat at the front of the room, spine-straight, hands folded, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Miss Langford, Datchet said, when he'd finished his prepared remarks, would you care to respond to these concerns before the board votes? Sarah stood. I would. Her voice carried clear and steady across the crowded room. I came to this town 11 weeks ago to teach children to read and write. And I have done exactly that every single day with no complaint from a single parent in this room. Some weeks ago, I extended that same teaching to a grown man who had been denied the chance to learn as a child, a man now fighting in a county courtroom tomorrow, to save the land his own father built, against a wealthy neighbor determined to take it from him. She let her gaze move slowly across the crowded benches, resting briefly on faces she'd come to know over these past months. I am told this constitutes impropriety. I would ask this board and everyone gathered here tonight to consider a different question. What does it say about this town that teaching a grown man his letters is treated as a scandal, while a wealthy man's attempt to steal water from a poor rancher's family is treated as simply the way business is done? A murmur moved through the room. Sarah pressed forward before it could settle. I will not apologize for teaching Jedediah Colter to read. I will not apologize for staying late to do it, nor for believing that a man's right to understand the documents that govern his own life matters more than the appearance of propriety. If this board wishes to dismiss me over that belief, I would ask only that you say so plainly, so that every parent in this room can decide for themselves whether they wish their children taught by someone willing to compromise on that principle, or by someone who won't. She sat down. The room was silent for a long moment. Then from the back bench, Widow Hutchins, who had ridden 2 hours into town specifically for this meeting, though no one had asked her to, rose slowly to her feet. I've known this valley 60 years, the old woman said, her voice cracking with age but carrying clear across the room nonetheless. Seen plenty of foolishness pass for propriety in that time, and plenty of decency get punished for looking unfamiliar. This young woman taught a grown man to read, so he could fight for what's rightfully his against a man who's been trying to steal from this valley for 2 generations running. Seems to me the board's got its priorities turned clean around backward, and I'd say so to any one of you personal if you cared to ask. Another voice rose from the crowd. Ezra Watts this time standing without waiting to be called on. Seconded near enough. This town owes Miss Langford a debt, not a dismissal. Datchet's face had gone red, glancing nervously toward the door, as if hoping Whitlock himself might materialize to rescue the moment. The vote, when it finally came, fell 3-2 in Sarah's favor, narrower than it should have been, but enough. Sarah exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and across the room in the back row, where he'd insisted on sitting despite her protests, that he needn't come at all. Jed. Colter watched her with an expression that had nothing to do with the reading lessons, and everything to do with something neither of them had yet found the courage to name. Yeb. They rode back to Colter Ridge together after the meeting adjourned. The night quiet and cool around them, the weight of both their fights, hers won his, still hanging one day away, sitting heavy and shared between them. "You didn't have to come tonight," Sarah said as they walked their horses side by side along the dark road. "You've got your own hearing tomorrow. You should have been resting, not sitting through my troubles on top of your own. Wasn't a question of having to." Jed kept his eyes forward, though his voice carried something careful, deliberate. "Man doesn't abandon the person who taught him his own name first time she needs someone standing in her corner." Sarah glanced over at him, something soft moving across her face in the moonlight. "Whitlock threatened your position," Jed said quietly. "Yesterday. Told me plain he'd see you dismissed if I didn't drop the claim." Sarah's jaw tightened. "And you didn't tell him yes?" "Didn't even consider it." Jed's voice roughened. "Told him I'd see him in court, whatever it cost either of us." They rode in silence a moment, the only sound the soft fall of hooves on the dark road. "Jed," Sarah said finally, "whatever happens tomorrow, win or lose, I want you to know I don't regret one evening of this. Not the lessons, not the risk to my position, not any of it." Jed pulled his horse to a stop, and after a moment Sarah stopped hers too, turning to face him in the dark. "Sarah, I got one more day before I walk into that courtroom and find out whether everything you taught me was enough to save my father's land," he said, his voice low, rough with something he'd been holding back for weeks now. "I don't rightly know what tomorrow's gonna bring, but I know I don't want to face it not having said this first." "Said what?" "That somewhere between that first note at my gate and tonight, watching you stand up in front of half this town and refuse to back down, I stopped thinking of you as my teacher, Sarah Langford. Started thinking of you as something I ain't got the right words for yet, seeing as you're the one who taught me every word I know." Sarah's breath caught something bright and unguarded breaking open across her face in the moonlight. "I think," she said softly, "you've found the right words, just fine, Jed Colter." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the night quiet and full around them. 6 days of fear and fire and stubborn courage settled finally into something neither of them had dared name until now. "Tomorrow," Jed said finally, his voice steady despite everything still hanging over it. "I walk into that courtroom, and whatever Whitlock's got waiting for me, whatever that judge decides, I'm not walking in there ashamed of who I am anymore. Not for the first time in my whole life." "No," Sarah agreed, reaching over to take his hand in the dark, steady and sure. "You're walking in there as a man who fought for everything he has and everyone he loves. That's more than most men in this valley will ever be able to say." They rode the rest of the way back to Colter Ridge in a silence that held nothing uncertain in it at all. Two people who had found in the space of a few desperate weeks something neither fire nor threats nor an entire town's cruelty had managed to burn away. Morning came gray and unhurried the way it always did, whether or not a man was ready for it. And Jed Colter had been awake since well before the sky started to lighten, sitting at his kitchen table, with his father's charred map fragment spread out in front of him, staring at the single surviving corner of a boundary line that might not be enough to save anything at all. He'd rehearsed the reading 100 times in his head through the night. The words from his father's original claim, the ones he and Sarah had worked through line by line under lamplight, now existing nowhere but inside his own skull, because the paper that had once held them was ash in his own hearth. He dressed carefully, his one good shirt pressed the night before, though his hands hadn't been steady enough to do it well, and rode into Copper Hollow with the sun still low behind him, his stomach a hard knot the whole way. Sarah was waiting outside the courthouse when he arrived, standing very straight in a dark blue dress, her hands folded in front of her, in a way that didn't quite hide how tightly they were clenched. "You look like a man walking to his own hanging," she said, trying for lightness, and not quite managing it. "Feels a fair sight like it. You know what you know, Jed. Nobody in that room can take that away from you now, whatever paper does or doesn't survive to prove it." He nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen any. Ezra Watts arrived a few minutes later, leading Widow Hutchins by the arm. Up the courthouse steps, the old woman moving slow but steady, her chin set with the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided long ago not to be intimidated by anything wearing a robe. Tom Reardon came last, alone on foot, a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder that he clutched like it held something precious. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't meet Jed's eye, just found a spot near the courthouse door and stood there waiting, with the look of a man already regretting his decision to come at all. "He brought something," Sarah murmured, watching the old surveyor from across the steps. "Look at how he's holding that bag." "Might be nothing. Might be everything." Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the satchel a moment longer before the courthouse doors swung open and a clerk called them all inside. The courtroom was smaller than Jed had imagined. Close and warm, with too many bodies packed onto too few benches, half the town of Copper Hollow having turned out to watch, drawn by the particular hunger small towns carried for a good public spectacle. Silas Whitlock sat at the front, calm and composed, in a suit too fine for a frontier courthouse, with a narrow, sharp-faced man beside him that Jed took to be Cyrus Beadle, the lawyer from Helena, exactly as Ezra had warned. Judge Harlan Voss took his seat at the front of the room a few minutes later, a heavy-set man with a graying beard and tired eyes that swept the room once briefly before settling on his docket without any particular expression Jed could read. "Case of Colter versus Whitlock regarding disputed water rights along the north boundary of Colter Ridge property," the clerk announced. "Mr. Whitlock's counsel may proceed." Cyrus Beadle rose smoothly, buttoning his coat, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done this 100 times and expected to win 101. "Your Honor, this matter is at its heart quite simple." Beadle's voice carried easily across the crowded room, cultured and precise. In 1878, a formal county survey established the boundary lines of the Whitlock property, including the North Creek in dispute. That survey, he said, lifting a thick-bound document from the table before him, was conducted by licensed surveyors properly filed with the county recorder's office and has stood unchallenged for 6 years. He set the document down with a deliberate weight, letting its thickness speak for itself. Mr. Colter's claim rests, as far as we understand, on the memory of elderly neighbors and the alleged existence of a hand-drawn map that conveniently was destroyed in a fire before it could ever be produced as evidence. Beadle's mouth curved into something not quite a smile. "We would ask the court to consider which of these two claims deserves greater weight, a formal, filed professional survey or a burned scrap of paper and the say-so of a man who, by his own admission, only recently learned to read at all." A murmur moved through the courtroom. Jed felt his face go hot, felt 30 years of shame rise up in his chest, exactly where Beadle had aimed it. Sarah's hand found his beneath the table, gripping hard. "Objection to characterization, Your Honor," said the young attorney. Ezra had scraped together funds to hire on Jed's behalf a nervous, earnest man named Pruitt's cousin, barely out of his own law studies, entirely outmatched by Beadle's polish. "Mr. Colter's literacy has no bearing on the legitimacy of his family's claim." "Sustained," Judge Voss said, though his tone carried little conviction behind it. "Continue, Mr. Beadle." Beadle inclined his head, entirely unbothered. "Of course, Your Honor. I merely wish to establish the relative strength of documentation available to this court." The morning wore on, in a slow, grinding procession of documents Jed only partly understood. Beadle laying out survey markers and county filings and expert testimony from a licensed surveyor, brought up special from Helena. Each piece stacking neatly atop the last building, a wall of official paper that Jed's small pile of witnesses seemed increasingly unlikely to breach. By the time the court broke for a brief recess at midday, Jed felt the knot in his stomach had grown into something closer to dread. "They've got him beat," he said quietly to Sarah out in the hallway away from the crowd. "All that paper, all them experts. What have we got against that? An old woman's memory and a surveyor's grudge." "We've got the truth," Sarah said. "That's not nothing, Jed. Truth don't mean much in a room full of paper that says otherwise." "Then we make sure it does." Sarah's eyes were fierce despite the exhaustion showing at their edges. "Reardon hasn't testified yet. Whatever he's carrying in that satchel, he came here today prepared to show it. Trust that, if nothing else." The afternoon session opened with Widow Hutchins called to the stand, and she made her way up with the same slow, deliberate dignity she'd carried up the courthouse steps that morning, settling into the witness chair like a woman entirely unbothered by the grandeur of the room around her. "State your name and how long you've resided in this valley." Beadle said, his tone shifting into something gentler, now condescending in a way that assumed her age made her an easy target. "Margaret Hutchins. 61 years in this valley, young man, since before you were likely born." A small ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom. Beadle's jaw tightened slightly. "And you claim to recall the boundaries of the disputed creek from decades past." "I don't claim to recall it. I remember it." Her voice was steady, unhurried. "Watered my own stock along that creek for near 20 years before the Colters ever bought the neighboring land. And I watched Amos Colter water his herd there too every summer for years after, with nobody ever once questioning his right to it. Not till Silas Whitlock decided he wanted it for himself." Memory can be an imprecise instrument, Mrs. Hutchins, particularly across 6 decades. "My memory buried a husband, 3 children, and more hard winters than I care to count, Mr. Beadle. It's plenty precise where it needs to be." Her eyes cut toward him, sharp as flint. "I know that creek, same as I know my own name, and I'll say so under oath as many times as this court requires." Beadle tried a different angle, producing a document that suggested a survey marker predating even Hutchins's memory, questioning whether her recollection of the boundary might simply be mistaken about which creek entirely. Hutchins held firm through every question, unshaken, and by the time Beadle finally released her from the stand, something in the courtroom's mood had shifted, not decisively, but enough that Jed allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. Tom Riordan was called next, and he rose from his seat slowly, the canvas satchel still clutched to his chest, his weathered face carrying a reluctance that hadn't eased at all since morning. "You assisted in the original 1878 county survey of this territory. Is that correct?" Jed's young attorney asked, doing his best to guide the witness with more confidence than he clearly felt. "That's right. I was the surveyor's assistant. Carried the chains, held the markers, recorded the field notes while the head surveyor called out his measurements." "And do you recall the boundary as it related to the North Creek on what is now Colter property?" Riordan hesitated, glancing once toward Whitlock's table, then away. "I recall it," he said finally. "Would you tell the court what you recall?" Riordan was quiet a long moment, and Jed felt his heart hammering, felt the whole courtroom leaning forward slightly in the silence. "The original survey," Riordan said slowly, "marked that creek as running through Colter land. I know it because I'm the one who drove the boundary stake myself 40 feet east of where Whitlock's more recent survey claims the line falls." A murmur swept through the courtroom, louder this time. "Objection," Beadle said quickly, rising. "This witness's memory of a boundary stake driven decades ago cannot be verified without physical evidence." "I've got physical evidence," Riordan said before the judge could even rule, and reached into his satchel. He drew out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle with age, and held it up for the courtroom to see. "My own field notes," he said. "Kept 'em all these years tucked away on account of I never much trusted my memory to hold everything straight on its own. Every measurement I took on that original survey written down the same day I took it, including the exact placement of that boundary stake along the North Creek." The courtroom erupted into noise, the judge banging his gavel twice to restore order. And Jed sat frozen, watching decades of careful, quiet honesty from a stubborn old man crack open exactly the door they needed. "Your Honor," Beadle said, recovering quickly, "we would need time to examine this notebook's authenticity before—" "The court will grant that examination." Judge Voss said, his tired eyes sharper now than they'd been all morning. "But I intend to hear the remainder of Mr. Reardon's testimony first. Continue, Counselor." Riordan's testimony took the better part of an hour. His field notes examined and cross-examined Beadle, working hard to find any crack in the old man's decades-old handwriting, any inconsistency that might undo what had just been laid bare in front of the entire courtroom. He found none. Reardon's notes held firm, precise, and dated and utterly unshakable, and by the time the old surveyor finally stepped down from the witness chair, something had visibly shifted in the room, a current of doubt now running beneath Whitlock's carefully constructed case that hadn't existed an hour before. Whitlock's face, Jed noticed, had gone tight and pale, his composure cracking at the edges for the first time all day. "Your Honor," Beadle said, standing again, his voice carrying a fraction less confidence than it had that morning. "The defense would like to call Mr. Colter himself to the stand to establish the reliability, or lack thereof, of his own claims supporting testimony." Jed's stomach dropped. Beside him, his young attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, "You don't have to agree to this, Jed. It's an unusual request calling the plaintiff to testify against his own case's credibility. I can object." Jed sat with that a moment, his heart hammering, 30 years of hidden shame rising up hot in his throat at the thought of Beadle picking him apart in front of the whole town. Then he thought of Sarah's hand under the table, of his father's handwriting on that burned scrap of paper, of every single evening spent in a child's desk, forcing his hand steady around letters that had once seemed like an enemy language. "Let him call me," Jed said quietly. "I ain't hiding from nothing anymore." He took the stand with his heart pounding so hard he was certain the whole room could hear it. But his hands, when he folded them in his lap, were steadier than he expected them to be. "Mr. Colter," Beadle began, circling closer, "you've testified through counsel that your father's original land deed included specific documentation of the North Creek boundary." "That's right. A document you claim was destroyed in a fire at your property several days before this hearing." "That's right, too." "How convenient," Beadle said, letting the word sit, "that the one piece of physical evidence supporting your claim happened to burn just days before you'd need to produce it." "Convenient for you, maybe," Jed said, and something in his voice made a few people in the courtroom shift in their seats. "Wasn't convenient for me. Lost the one thing my father left behind that might have proved this whole fight didn't need to happen at all. Do you have any evidence as to how the fire started?" Jed hesitated. He had suspicion. He had Duke Marsh's grin in the saloon, and the particular satisfaction the man had worn ever since. But suspicion wasn't proof, and he knew it. "No," he admitted. "Not proof. Just a strong notion of who benefited most from that map disappearing right when it did." "Speculation, Your Honor," Beadle said quickly. "So noted," Judge Voss said, though something in his expression suggested the notion had landed, regardless of whether it counted as formal evidence. Beadle pressed on, working to establish that Jed's own understanding of the documents, even the ones he had managed to read, remained unreliable, given how recently he'd learned to read at all. "You'll forgive the court's skepticism, Mr. Colter, at the notion that a man who could not read a single word a month ago now claims sufficient literacy to interpret complex legal boundary language." "I didn't interpret it alone," Jed said. "Had help. Same as any man does learning something new. Don't make what I learned any less true." "And who provided this help?" Jed felt the trap closing before Beadle even finished. The question felt exactly where this was headed, and beside him, he saw Sarah go very still. "Miss Sarah Langford," Jed said. "The town schoolteacher." "The same Miss Langford," Beadle said, his voice taking on a new, sharper edge. "Who has, I understand, faced recent scrutiny before the school board regarding the propriety of her private evening meetings with you. A single woman alone with an unmarried man, night after night for weeks. A ripple of scandalized murmuring moved through the courtroom. Jed felt fury rise hot and fast in his chest. That's got nothing to do with this case. On the contrary, Mr. Colter, it has a great deal to do with the reliability of your evidence if the woman providing your reading assistance has motives beyond simple charity. Objection. Jed's young attorney was on his feet now, red-faced. Your Honor, this is a baseless attempt to malign a witness's character rather than address the actual merits of the case. Sustained. Judge Voss said sharper this time, clearly losing patience. Mr. Beadle, confine your questions to the matter at hand. Beadle inclined his head, but the damage the seed of scandal planted in front of the whole watching town had already taken root, and Jed could see it in the faces around the room in Otis Pruitt's barely concealed satisfaction, near the back, in the way several women shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The courtroom broke for a short recess before closing arguments, and Jed found Sarah standing rigid near the courthouse steps, her face pale, her composure cracking for the first time all day. I'm sorry, Jed said immediately. Sarah, I never meant to drag your name into that. Should have refused to answer, should have. You told the truth, Sarah said, though her voice shook slightly. I won't have you apologize for that, not after everything you fought to be able to do it. He made it sound filthy, made it sound like... I know what he made it sound like. Sarah's jaw tightened. It's not the first time a man's tried to make my choices sound scandalous, rather than admit they simply don't approve of a woman making choices at all. It won't be the last either. Silas Whitlock chose that exact moment to approach, unhurried, a small, satisfied smile playing at the edges of his mouth, despite the setback Reardon's testimony had dealt him. Quite a spectacle in there, he said, addressing neither of them directly, looking instead out over the crowded courthouse yard. Shame how these things can turn once a man's private business becomes public business. Reputation's a fragile thing in a town this size. Say what you came to say, Whitlock, Jed said low. Simple enough. Withdraw your claim right now before closing arguments. I'll see to it. My lawyer softens his line of questioning about Miss Langford's associations. Save her whatever's left of her reputation in this town. Whitlock's eyes flicked toward Sarah, deliberate and cold. Refuse, and I promise you, by the time Beadle finishes his closing remarks, there won't be a family left in Copper Hollow willing to send their children to her schoolhouse. Sarah stepped forward before Jed could answer. Her chin lifted, her voice cutting and clear. Mr. Whitlock, I left a life in Boston, rather than let a man decide what risks I was permitted to take with my own reputation. I did not come 2,000 miles west to let you succeed where an entire wealthy family in Massachusetts failed. Her eyes held his without flinching. Say whatever you please in that courtroom. I have survived worse than gossip, and I intend to survive this too. Whitlock's smile flickered just slightly, something almost like respect moving briefly across his face, before it hardened back into contempt. Your funeral, both of you, he said, and walked away. The clerk's voice calling the court back into session cut through the tension like a blade, and Jed and Sarah returned to their seats, with the whole weight of the confrontation still sitting heavy between them. Closing arguments began with Beadle smooth and confident, despite the crack Reardon's testimony had put in his case, working hard to recast the old surveyor's notebook as questionable, insufficient, a single uncorroborated document against an entire formal survey filed and recognized by the county for 6 years running. Your Honor, he concluded, the court must decide between certainty and speculation, between a documented professional survey and a collection of aging memories, personal grudges, and one convenient notebook produced at the 11th hour by a witness with clear animosity toward my client. We ask the court to uphold the original survey as filed and rule in favor of Mr. Whitlock's claim. He sat. Jed's young attorney rose considerably less polished, but carrying a conviction that hadn't been there that morning. Your Honor, "This case has never truly been about paper versus memory," he said. "It's been about which paper and whose memory deserves this court's trust. We've heard from two independent witnesses with no financial stake in this outcome, an elderly widow with 60 years' knowledge of this valley, and the very surveyor's assistant who helped draw the original boundary lines himself, corroborated by his own contemporaneous field notes. Against that, we have a more recent survey commissioned and paid for by the very man who stands to profit from its conclusions." He gestured toward Jed. "And we have Jedediah Colter himself, a man denied the chance to learn his letters as a child, who spent weeks of desperate, humbling effort teaching himself to read well enough to stand in this courtroom and defend his father's legacy with his own voice, rather than relying on anyone to speak for him. We would ask the court to consider what kind of man does that. Not a man building a fraudulent claim. A man fighting with everything he has for the truth." The courtroom had gone very quiet. Judge Voss sat with his hands folded, his tired eyes moving slowly between the two tables, something unreadable working behind his expression. "The court will take a brief recess to consider its ruling," he said, finally rising. "We will reconvene within the hour." Check. The hour stretched unbearably. Jed paced the courthouse hallway, unable to sit still. Sarah watching him with quiet, steady patience that he drew on more than he could say. "Whatever happens," she said, catching his arm as he passed her for the third time, "you should know something, Jed." "What's that?" "You already won something today that no judge's ruling can take away from you." Her eyes were warm, despite the exhaustion in them. "You stood up in that courtroom in front of the whole town that once laughed at you, and you read your own truth out loud. Nobody spoke it for you. That happened whatever the judge decides next." Jed stopped his pacing, some of the frantic energy draining out of him as he looked at her. "Wouldn't have happened at all without you," he said quietly. "It happened because of you, Jed. I only opened a door. You're the one who walked through it every single night, even when it hurt." Before he could answer, a commotion broke out near the courthouse entrance. Raised voices, a scuffle of some kind, and both of them turned to see a young stable hand, barely more than a boy, being half-dragged toward the courthouse by Ezra Watts, the old man's face grim with purpose. "Tell them what you told me, son," Ezra was saying, low and urgent. "Tell them exactly what you saw that night." The boy. Jed recognized him now, a stable hand who worked odd jobs around town, sometimes mucking stalls at the livery, looked terrified, glancing around at the gathering crowd of onlookers. "I don't want no trouble, Mr. Watts." "Trouble's already here, son. Question is whether you're gonna let an innocent man lose his water rights while you stay quiet about what you saw." Jed crossed the hallway fast, Sarah right behind him. "What is this, Ezra?" Ezra's jaw was tight. "This is Billy Nash. Works nights sometimes at the Whitlock stable. Tell him Billy." Billy Nash swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the courthouse doors, as if Whitlock himself might burst through them at any moment. "Night your place burned, Mr. Colter?" he said, his voice shaking. "I was walking home late, cutting across past your property line on account of it shorter than the road. Saw a rider coming hard away from your house maybe an hour 'fore I heard talk in town the next morning about your trunk being stolen." "Who was it?" Jed said, though he already knew the answer sitting cold and certain in his gut. "Duke Marsh," Billy said. "Recognized his horse plain as day. Big bay gelding with a white sock on the left foreleg. Ain't but one horse like that in this whole valley." The hallway had gone silent around them, several onlookers who'd drifted close enough to hear now exchanging looks of stunned recognition. "Would you say that in front of the judge?" Sarah asked, her voice urgent. Billy hesitated, fear plain on his young face. "Mr. Whitlock's my employer, ma'am. Man like that finds out I testified against his foreman." "A man like that," Ezra said, cutting in gentle but firm, "has already shown this whole valley exactly what he's willing to do to win Son. Question you gotta ask yourself is whether you want to spend the rest of your life knowing you stayed quiet while it happened." Billy Nash stood there a long moment, visibly wrestling with himself, and then the clerk's voice rang out from inside the courtroom, calling everyone back for the judge's ruling. "Court's reconvening." the clerk announced. "All parties please return to your seats." They filed back into the courtroom, Jed's heart hammering with a fresh, sharper fear, now not just for the ruling about to come, but for whether Billy Nash would find the courage to follow them inside at all. Judge Voss took his seat, the room falling into a tense, expectant hush, every eye fixed on the tired, unreadable face at the front of the room. "Before I render my decision," Judge Voss began, his voice carrying a gravity that hadn't been there earlier that day, "I want to address something troubling that has come to my attention during this recess." A murmur rippled through the room. Jed felt his stomach drop, uncertain whether this boded well or disastrously. "It has been reported to this court," Voss continued, "that a witness has come forward with information relevant to the destruction of evidence in this case, specifically the fire that consumed documents belonging to the plaintiff, Mr. Colter, mere days before this hearing." Every eye in the courtroom swung toward the door, and there, standing hesitant and pale in the entrance, was Billy Nash, Ezra Watts's hand steady on his shoulder. "Your Honor," Ezra called out, "if the court will permit, this young man has testimony bearing directly on that matter." Cyrus Beadle was on his feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular, introducing a new witness after closing arguments have already." "This court," Judge Voss said, cutting him off with unexpected sharpness, "takes allegations of evidence tampering extremely seriously, Mr. Beadle, regardless of the procedural timing of their discovery. I will hear this witness." Silas Whitlock's face had gone rigid pale, his composure finally cracking entirely as Billy Nash was called forward, sworn in with trembling hands, and asked to repeat what he'd told Ezra Watts in the hallway. The boy's voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke, the whole courtroom leaning forward to catch every word. The rider fleeing Colter Ridge, the distinctive bay gelding with the white sock, the timing that matched exactly with the discovery of the fire the following morning. "Duke Marsh," Billy said, finally, the name landing like a stone dropped into still water. "I'd swear to it on anything you like, Your Honor. Wasn't no mistaking that horse." The courtroom erupted into noise, Judge Voss banging his gavel hard and through the chaos. Jed watched Silas Whitlock's face transform, the calm confidence of the morning entirely gone, now replaced by something cornered and furious, his eyes darting toward the door, as if calculating an escape that didn't exist. "Your Honor," Whitlock said, rising abruptly, his voice sharper than Jed had ever heard it. "I had no knowledge of any such action taken by my foreman. If Duke Marsh acted alone in some misguided attempt to—" "Sit down, Mr. Whitlock," Judge Voss said, his voice carrying a hard finality that silenced the entire room. "This court will determine the relevance of this testimony to the matter of evidence destruction separately through proper investigation. But I will say this plainly for the record, in front of everyone gathered here today." He paused, letting the silence stretch his tired eyes, settling directly on Whitlock's pale, furious face. "A pattern has emerged in this courtroom today that concerns me a great deal more than any dispute over creek boundaries," Voss said slowly. "A pattern of intimidation, of destroyed evidence appearing suspiciously timed to disadvantage the opposing party, of character attacks launched against witnesses whose only offense appears to be assisting a man in learning to read his own family's documents." He turned his gaze toward Jed, and something in the old judge's tired eyes had shifted entirely from where it had rested that morning. "Mr. Colter," Voss said, "you have presented this court with sworn testimony from two independent, credible witnesses corroborated by contemporaneous physical evidence in the form of Mr. Riordan's original field notes. You have done so despite significant personal hardship and despite what now appears to be a deliberate effort to sabotage your ability to mount a proper defense." The courtroom held its breath. "I am prepared," Judge Voss said, "to render my ruling on the matter of the water rights." Every eye in the room fixed on him. The silence so complete, Jed could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Sarah's hand gripping his beneath the table, hard enough to hurt the entire weight of the past 26 days, balanced on the razor's edge of whatever words came next. Judge Voss opened his mouth to speak, and at that exact moment, The courtroom doors burst open behind them, and Duke Marsh himself stood framed in the doorway, wild-eyed, breathing hard, a look on his face that belonged to a man who had ridden hard and fast to reach this room before it was too late. Though whether he'd come to confess or to run, not a single soul in that courtroom yet knew. Duke Marsh stood in the doorway with his hat gone, his shirt torn at one shoulder, breathing like a man who'd run his horse near to death getting here. And for one long moment, nobody in that courtroom moved at all. "Your Honor." Duke started, but his voice cracked on the words, and he had to swallow hard and try again. "Your Honor, I need to speak." "Mr. Marsh," Judge Voss said slowly, his tired eyes narrowing with the particular sharpness of a man who smelled something important about to break open in his courtroom. "You are aware you have just been named in sworn testimony regarding the destruction of evidence in this case." "I know it. I heard it standing outside." Duke's eyes swept the room, found Whitlock's face pale rigid, a warning etched into every line of it, and something in Duke seemed to buckle under the weight of that look rather than draw strength from it. "Then you understand the gravity of what you're about to say." "I understand." Duke's hands were shaking. He wiped them against his trousers, glanced once more at Whitlock, and something in his face hardened into a decision. "I burned it, the trunk. Rode out to Colter's place while he was off at his lessons, same as Mr. Whitlock told me to do." The courtroom exploded into noise. Judge Voss's gavel came down hard twice, 3 times, before the room settled back into a ragged, breathless quiet. "Silence or I clear this courtroom," Voss snapped, and waited until every last murmur had died before turning back to Duke Marsh with an expression carved from stone. "Say that again, Mr. Marsh. Slowly, for the record." Duke's jaw worked. Sweat had broken out along his hairline despite the cool afternoon, and Jed watched the man's eyes dart one more time toward Whitlock's table, watched Whitlock's mouth open as if to stop him, watched Duke look away first. "Mr. Whitlock told me," Duke said, each word coming harder than the last, "that if Colter's old papers happened to disappear before the hearing, the whole case would fall apart on its own, and there wouldn't be nothing left to argue over. Told me there'd be a bonus in it for me if I saw to it personal." "That's a lie." Whitlock was on his feet, now his composure entirely gone, his face a mottled red that hadn't been there all morning. "Your Honor, this man is clearly attempting to save his own hide by inventing." "Sit down, Mr. Whitlock." Judge Voss said, his voice carrying an iron edge that hadn't been there before. "Or I will have the bailiff seat you." Whitlock sat slowly, his hands trembling with a fury he could no longer disguise. "Continue, Mr. Marsh," the judge said. "I did it," Duke said again, louder this time, as if saying it twice made it more real, or maybe just easier to bear. "Rode out there, broke the lock on his door, took the trunk, and burned every last page of it in his own hearth. Wasn't proud of it. Ain't proud of it now. But I was following orders, same as any man does his job, and Mr. Whitlock's the one who gave the order." "That is an outrageous fabrication," Whitlock said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier force. "I gave no such—" "You gave it in your own study," Duke said, turning on him now, something raw and furious breaking loose in his voice. "The same night you told me you'd double my wages if I made sure Colter walked into this courtroom with nothing left to prove his claim. Told me Colter was too stupid to ever prove where I'd been that night anyhow, on account of he can't hardly read his own name." "Well..." Duke's eyes swept toward Jed, something almost like shame crossing his face. "Turns out he learned faster than either of us figured." The courtroom had gone utterly silent, every soul in the room hanging on Duke's next word. "I ain't going to prison alone for something you ordered done," Duke said to Whitlock, his voice shaking with something between fear and fury. "You want to call me a liar in front of this whole town, go right ahead. But I got nothing left to lose by telling the truth now, and you got everything." Judge Voss let the silence stretch a long moment, his eyes moving slowly between Whitlock's rigid, furious face and Duke Marsh's trembling one, weighing something in the balance that had nothing to do with creek boundaries anymore. "This court," he said finally, will refer the matter of evidence destruction and witness intimidation to the county sheriff for criminal investigation against both Mr. Marsh and, pending further inquiry, Mr. Whitlock himself. He let that land, watching Whitlock's face go from red to ashen. As for the civil matter before this court today, the question of water rights along the disputed north boundary of Colter Ridge, he paused, and in that pause the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as one single body. "I find in favor of the plaintiff, Jedediah Colter," Judge Voss said. The original 1878 survey, as corroborated by Mr. Reardon's contemporaneous field notes, and Mrs. Hutchins' long-standing personal knowledge of the property, is hereby recognized as the accurate boundary of record. The more recent survey submitted by the defendant is found to be either mistaken or, given the evidence of tampering and intimidation presented today, deliberately falsified. The North Creek and its associated water rights remain the rightful property of the Colter family now and going forward. The gavel came down once, final and absolute, and the courtroom erupted not into the scandalized murmur of before, but into something closer to a roar. Half the room on its feet, and Jed sat frozen in his chair for one long, disbelieving moment, before Sarah's arms were around his neck, and the sound of the room came rushing back in all at once. He didn't remember standing, didn't remember exactly how he ended up on his feet with Sarah's face buried against his shoulder and his own arms wrapped tight around her, the courtroom noise washing over them both like water breaking over a rock that had finally stopped fighting the current. "You did it," Sarah said, pulling back just enough to look at him, her eyes bright with tears she wasn't bothering to hide. "Jed, you did it." "We did it." He said the same words he'd said to her 11 days ago in an empty schoolhouse. Except this time, there was nothing tentative in them at all. Around them, the courtroom had descended into chaos. Widow Hutchins being embraced by half a dozen well-wishers who'd barely spoken to her in years. Ezra Watts pumping Tom Reardon's hand so hard, the old surveyor looked faintly alarmed. Billy Nash standing off to one side, looking equal parts terrified and relieved that the worst of it had already happened. And near the front of the room, Silas Whitlock sat alone at his table, his lawyer already gathering papers with the brisk efficiency of a man eager to distance himself from a losing client. Whitlock's face, a mask of fury and disbelief, watching the entire town he'd spent years believing he controlled turn its back on him in the space of a single afternoon. He caught Jed's eye across the room, and for one long moment, neither man looked away. "This isn't finished, Colter," Whitlock said low, though the words carried in the thinning crowd. "You think a courtroom ruling changes anything about how this valley really works? I've got money. I've got friends. This," he gestured at the chaos around him, "this is a setback, nothing more." "Maybe so," Jed said, and something in his voice had a steadiness in it that hadn't existed a month earlier, a certainty that came from someplace deeper than the ruling itself. "But you lost something today you ain't getting back whatever money or friends you got left. This whole town just watched you get caught lying, cheating, and ordering a man to burn another family's legacy to the ground. Money don't buy that kind of thing back, Whitlock. Not in a town this size." Whitlock's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Jed had known him, the man had no smooth answer ready. "Sheriff will be wanting a word with you directly," Ezra Watts said, appearing at Jed's shoulder with unmistakable satisfaction. "Might want to save your breath for that conversation instead, Silas." Whitlock gathered what remained of his composure, straightened his coat with hands that weren't quite steady, and walked out of the courthouse without another word, the crowd parting around him, the way water parts around something it no longer trusts. The town didn't let go of the story easily. Copper Hollow ran on gossip the way it ran on rain and cattle prices, and by the following morning, there wasn't a soul within 10 miles who hadn't heard some version of what happened in that courtroom. Duke Marsh's confession growing more dramatic with each retelling. Whitlock's downfall spoken of in the same hushed, satisfied tones, usually reserved for tales of comeuppance in old scripture, Jed rode into town 3 days after the ruling, more out of necessity than desire, needing supplies he'd put off buying through the whole ordeal, and found the mercantile fuller than usual. Several men gathered near the counter, deep in conversation that stopped the moment he walked through the door. Otis Pruitt looked up from behind the counter, and for the first time since Jed had known him, the man's easy, mocking grin was nowhere in sight. "Colter." Otis cleared his throat, straightened a stack of goods that didn't need straightening. "Heard about the ruling. Good outcome, that." "Reckon it was." "About what I said before," Otis continued, not quite meeting Jed's eyes. "In here that day about the mail, I spoke out of turn. Wasn't right of me making sport of a man's private struggles in front of the whole store like that." Jed studied him a long moment. It would have been easy a month earlier to let the apology slide past him unacknowledged, to nod and buy his goods and leave the way he'd always left every uncomfortable moment in this town. Quiet, quick, unremarked. "Reckon it wasn't," Jed said instead. "Man's got a right to struggle with something without the whole town making a show of it. I'd take that as a lesson worth keeping Otis going forward." Otis nodded, chastened, and rang up Jed's purchases without another word, though something in the exchange sat lighter in Jed's chest than he expected, not triumph exactly, but the particular relief of a wound finally being acknowledged instead of just endured in silence. Duke Marsh, he learned before he left town that day, had been arrested and was already talking freely to the sheriff, eager to shift as much blame as possible onto Whitlock in exchange for whatever leniency the county might offer him. Whitlock himself remained under investigation, his standing in the valley crumbling by the day as more of his past dealings came under scrutiny. Old grievances from neighbors who'd never before found the courage to speak up now coming forward, emboldened by watching one wealthy, powerful man finally answer for his cruelty. Chatan. The reading room came to Jed almost by accident, born out of a conversation with Sarah on an evening not long after the ruling, the two of them sitting on the porch at Colter Ridge as the sun went down slow and gold over the mountains. "There's more men like me out here than folks realize," Jed said, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, watching the light fade. "Ranch hands mostly. Men who left school early or never went at all on account of their families needed the extra pair of hands more than they needed letters. Nobody talks about it. Everybody just carries it quiet, same as I did." "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, though something in her voice suggested she'd already guessed. "Thinking maybe Colter Ridge could use that old bunkhouse for something more than storage. Thinking maybe there's men in this valley who'd come learn their letters of an evening, same as I did, if they had a place to do it that didn't feel like a schoolroom full of children judging them for it." Sarah's face broke into something warm and unguarded. "You want to open a school?" "Poem. Wouldn't call it a school exactly. More a place. Somewhere a grown man could come learn without an audience, without shame hanging over every mistake he makes." Jed glanced at her, something almost shy in it, despite everything he'd already survived together with her. "Figured you might know a thing or two about how to run such a place, seeing as you're the one taught me everything I know." "I'd be honored," Sarah said, and meant it fully, her eyes bright in the fading light. "Though I imagine you'll want to teach some of it yourself, Jed. Nobody in this valley could speak to what that struggle feels like better than a man who's lived through it himself." Jed sat with that a long moment, something settling into place inside him that had been unsettled for 30 years. "Never thought of myself as somebody with anything to teach," he said quietly. "That's because for 30 years, you were taught to believe you had nothing worth teaching," Sarah said. "That was never true, Jed. It's simply what the silence around you made you believe." The reading room opened 3 weeks later, modest and unremarkable from the outside. Just the old bunkhouse scrubbed clean and fitted with a few borrowed desks and a shelf of primers Sarah had ordered special from Helena. But the first evening it opened, 6 grown men showed up, hats in their hands, uncertain and half ashamed, exactly as Jed himself had once been. He recognized every one of the expressions on their faces, the way they hovered near the door, unwilling to commit fully to walking inside. The way their eyes darted toward each other, silently checking whether anyone else looked as frightened as they felt. "Evenin'," Jed said, standing at the front of the small room, feeling the old familiar fear rise up even now, even here in a space he himself had built. "Reckon most of you know why you're here same as I once did. Ain't gonna pretend this is easy. It ain't. Took me the better part of a month learning enough to read my own father's deed well enough to save this ranch, and I still got plenty more to learn." He looked around the small circle of weathered, uncertain faces. "But I'll tell you what I learned past just letters," he continued. "I learned that not knowing something ain't the same as being stupid. I learned the men who mocked me for it were smaller men than they ever let on hiding their own fears behind somebody else's. And I learned that the hardest part of learning anything new ain't the learning itself. It's finding the courage to admit out loud in front of another living soul that you need help at all." One of the ranch hands near the back, a young man Jed recognized vaguely from the Hendricks spread, shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't easy admitting that," the young man said quietly. "No, it ain't," Jed agreed. "But I promise you this. Every single evening you show up here, whatever shame you're carrying gets a little bit lighter. Took me 39 years to learn that lesson. Figured I'd save the rest of you some time." A few of the men managed small, uncertain smiles at that, and Sarah, watching from the doorway, felt something warm and proud swell in her chest as Jed guided the group toward the first desk, sat down beside the youngest and most frightened of them, and began patiently the same way she'd once begun with him. It was 2 weeks after the reading room opened that the letter arrived, a second letter from Boston. This one carrying a black-edged border that Sarah recognized before she'd even broken the seal, her stomach dropping with a dread that settled deep and immediate. She read it alone in the schoolhouse, her hands trembling, and by the time Jed arrived that evening for what had become their now familiar routine, she was still sitting at her desk, the letter open before her, her face pale and drawn. "Sarah." He crossed the room fast, kneeling beside her chair. "What's happened?" "My father." Her voice came out thin, distant. "He's the letters from my aunt, not Nathaniel this time. She says he's taken a serious turn. Says the doctors don't expect he has more than a few weeks left, if that." Jed's hand found hers, steady and warm. "I have to go," Sarah said, though something in her voice sounded uncertain, even as she said it. "Whatever's happened between us, whatever I said about never going back, I can't let him die without seeing him once more, even if he never forgave me for leaving." "Then you go," Jed said simply. "Ain't no question about that, Sarah. Man's your father, whatever else stands between you. The reading room, the school, you." Her eyes came up to his full of a grief that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with fear. "Jed, if I go back to Boston even for a short while, Nathaniel will be there. My father on his deathbed will likely beg me to reconsider the marriage to secure my future before he's gone. And I don't know if I have the strength to keep saying no to a dying man's last wish." Jed was quiet a long moment, absorbing that something tightening in his own chest at the thought of her walking back into that world, that life, that man who'd once called her an episode. "You go," he said finally, his voice steady, despite what it clearly cost him to say it. "And you say your goodbyes to your father, because that's a thing a person needs to do, and I won't ever ask you not to. But Sarah, you come back here because it's what you choose, not because anybody dying or not talks you into believing you owe them your whole life in exchange for loving you." Sarah's eyes filled, and she reached up to touch his face, something fierce and grateful moving across her features. "How did you become a man capable of saying something like that?" she said softly. "When a month ago you could barely say your own name out loud in this very room." "Had a good teacher," Jed said, and the smallest smile broke through despite everything. She left 3 days later, the whole town turning out in small, quiet ways to see her off, parents whose children she'd taught the men from the reading room, who'd only just begun their own halting lessons. Widow Hutchins, pressing a small parcel of dried herbs into her hands for the long journey east. Jed rode with her as far as the train depot in the next county over, the two of them mostly silent on the long ride, the weight of the coming separation sitting heavy between them. 6 weeks, Sarah said as the train's whistle sounded in the distance, announcing its approach. Perhaps less if my father's condition is as grave as my aunt suggests. I'll write as often as I'm able. I'll be here, Jed said. Whatever happens back there, Sarah, whatever they say to try and keep you, or shame you, or convince you that Boston's where you belong. I'll be here waiting however long it takes. And if I come back different? She said something vulnerable, slipping through her usual composure. If Boston reminds me of things I've tried hard to forget, comfort and money, and a life that doesn't demand quite so much of a person, then you'll make your choice, Jed said simply. And I'll respect it, whatever it costs me to do it. But I don't believe for 1 second you're the same woman who left that city 11 weeks ago, Sarah. That woman wouldn't have stood up in a courtroom for a man's right to his own water, wouldn't have faced down a school board or a wealthy man's threats, or her own father's disapproval, all to fight for something she believed was right. The train pulled into the station with a great hiss of steam, and Sarah stood there a moment longer, searching his face like she was trying to memorize it. I love you, she said, quiet and sudden, and entirely without the careful composure she usually wore like armor. I don't know when exactly it happened, somewhere between that first note at your gate and watching you read your father's deed out loud in that courtroom. But it happened. Jed Colter and I needed you to know it before I got on this train. Jed's breath caught 39 years of guarded silence cracking open all at once. I love you too. He said the words coming out rough but absolutely certain. Knew it the night you told me your father was wrong about what letters were for men like me. Been certain of it every single day since. He kissed her then on the platform, in full view of whatever strangers happened to be watching, and neither of them cared at all. The weeks that followed crawled by slower than any Jed had endured, even the desperate 26 days before the hearing. He threw himself into the reading room, into the ranch work, into anything that might quiet the ache of her absence, and every evening he sat down to write her a letter. Slow, careful, still imperfect, but entirely his own words now, no longer requiring anyone else's hand to carry them. Her letters arrived irregularly, carried by the same slow mail that had once terrified him simply to hold. He read each one himself, now sounding out the unfamiliar words when he needed to, savoring every line she'd written. My father is weaker each day, she wrote in the third letter, though his mind remains sharp enough to remind me at every opportunity of everything I gave up by leaving. Nathaniel visits daily, always so carefully solicitous in front of my father, always colder the moment we're alone. He has proposed again. Jed has told my father he intends to rescue me from my frontier foolishness the moment I'm free to marry. My father, weak as he is, has begun to beg me to accept. Jed read that letter 3 times over his chest, tight, with a fear he tried hard not to let take root. Her 4th letter arrived nearly 2 weeks later, longer than the others, and something in its opening lines told him immediately that something significant had shifted. My father passed 11 days ago, she wrote. I will not pretend the grief is simple. It never is with a parent who loved imperfectly and demanded more than any child could reasonably give. But in his final hours, something changed between us. He asked me so quietly, I nearly missed it whether I was happy in the territory. I told him the truth, that I had never been more myself than I am there teaching fighting, loving a man who has taught me more about courage than any life in Boston ever could. He was quiet a long while after that. Then he told me in Jed, I still can hardly believe these were his last real words to me, that perhaps he had been wrong all those years about what made a life worth living. He died 2 days later, and though Nathaniel has continued pressing his suit even at the funeral itself, something in me has never felt more certain of what I intend to do next. Jed set the letter down with hands that weren't quite steady. Hope and grief tangled together in his chest. The final line of that letter he read a dozen times before he trusted himself to believe it. I am coming home, Jed. Not to Boston. Home to Copper Hollow, to the reading room, to a life I chose entirely for myself. Expect me within the fortnight. But the fortnight brought complications neither of them could have anticipated. Nathaniel Ashford arrived in Copper Hollow 4 days before Sarah herself, having followed her west with the singular determination of a man unwilling to accept a loss gracefully, and his arrival sent a ripple of curious gossip through the town, nearly as forceful as Whitlock's downfall had. Jed heard about it first from Ezra, who'd seen the well-dressed stranger asking pointed questions around town, inquiring after the schoolteacher, and more pointedly, after a rancher named Colter. "Man's got money written all over him," Ezra reported finding Jed at the reading room one evening. "Fancy suit, fancier manners, asking half the town where he might find you. Didn't much care for the way he asked it, if I'm honest." Jed's jaw tightened. He say what he wants. Didn't say directly. But a man don't cross half a country chasing after a woman who already told him no. Less he's convinced himself he can still change her mind. Nathaniel found Jed himself the following afternoon appearing at the edge of Colter Ridge, with an ease that suggested he'd never once doubted his welcome, dressed in a manner entirely unsuited to the dust and heat of the territory, his expression carrying the particular condescension of a man who'd never had to work for anything he wanted. "Mr. Colter, I presume?" Nathaniel didn't offer his hand. "I understand you've been keeping company with my fiancé." "Former fiancé, way I understand it," Jed said, standing his ground unbothered by the man's obvious attempt to establish dominance through wealth and bearing alone. "Sarah told me plain she left that engagement behind in Boston, along with everything else that didn't suit her anymore. Sarah is grieving," Nathaniel said, his voice taking on a patronizing gentleness that grated immediately. "Her judgment in the wake of her father's death cannot be trusted to make sound decisions about her future. I intend to see her safely return to Boston where she belongs, among people who understand her properly." "Funny thing about belonging," Jed said. "Seems to me a person belongs wherever they choose to build their own life, not wherever somebody else decides is proper for them." Nathaniel's composure cracked slightly, something colder showing beneath the polished surface. "You understand nothing of Sarah's world, Mr. Colter. A frontier rancher, however recently literate, cannot offer a woman of her breeding and education the life she deserves. Maybe not the life you think she deserves." Jed said, his voice steady, despite the old shame trying to claw its way back up at the deliberate jab about his literacy. "But I'd wager she's got her own notion of what she deserves, and I aim to trust her judgment on that a good deal more than yours, seeing as you're the one called her an episode in a letter not 2 months back." Something flickered across Nathaniel's face. Surprise quickly masked that Jed knew about the letter at all. "She showed you that—" Nathaniel said, his voice tightening. "She did. Showed me plenty about the life she left behind, and none of it made me eager to see her go back to it." Nathaniel studied him a long moment, something calculating moving behind his composed features. "I intend to be at the train depot when she arrives," he said finally. "I intend to remind her plainly and without your interference of everything waiting for her, should she choose to come to her senses. What she decides after that is of course entirely her own affair." "Fine by me," Jed said. "I trust her to make that choice clear, whatever you say to her." Nathaniel turned to leave, then paused, glancing back with something almost pitying in his expression. "You truly believe she'll choose this?" he said, gesturing vaguely at the dust and distance around them, "over everything Boston can offer her." "I believe," Jed said quietly, "that she already made that choice once the day she got on a train west and never looked back. Don't reckon a second train ride's gonna change what she already knows about herself." The day of Sarah's return arrived clear and bright, the whole town seeming to sense that something significant hung in the balance, though few beyond Jed and Ezra knew the full shape of what waited at that train depot. Jed rode out early, his stomach in knots that rivaled the morning of the courtroom hearing, and found Nathaniel Ashford already waiting on the platform when he arrived, dressed impeccably despite the dust of the territory. An expensive bouquet of hothouse flowers, clearly transported at considerable expense and difficulty, clutched in one gloved hand. Neither man spoke, as the minutes ticked past, the tension between them, thick enough to cut, until finally the distant whistle of the approaching train broke the silence. The train pulled in with a great exhale of steam, and Jed's heart hammered as passengers began to disembark, scanning each face. Until finally there, Sarah, stepping down from the train in a traveling dress, simpler than anything she'd have worn in Boston, her face lighting the moment she spotted him waiting on the platform. She started toward him immediately, and Nathaniel stepped forward to intercept her path. The bouquet extended, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "Sarah, my condolences again on your father. I've come to escort you home." Sarah stopped, looked at the flowers, looked at Nathaniel's carefully composed face, and something in her own expression hardened into a clarity that hadn't existed in her 11 weeks earlier. "Nathaniel." Her voice was polite but distant, the voice of a stranger rather than an intended bride. "I appreciate you coming so far, but I'm afraid you've wasted the journey. I am home." "Sarah, be reasonable. Your father's estate, your position in society, everything you were raised to expect from your life. My father's estate will be settled by his lawyers regardless of where I choose to live," Sarah said, cutting through his careful argument with a directness that visibly startled him. "My position in society died the moment I chose to teach children in a frontier schoolhouse rather than host dinner parties in Boston, and I have never once regretted that trade. And what I was raised to expect from my life, Nathaniel, was precisely the problem. A life chosen entirely by other people, on my behalf without ever once consulting what I might actually want." "And what is it you want?" Nathaniel said, his composure finally slipping into something sharper. "A rancher who only recently learned to read. A life of dust and poverty in the middle of nowhere. I want a man." Sarah said, her eyes moving past Nathaniel to find Jed's waiting gaze. "Who fought through weeks of shame and fear to learn something the world told him he was too old, too foolish, too broken to ever accomplish. I want a man who stood in a courtroom and read his own father's words aloud, rather than let anyone else speak for him. I want a man who never once in all these months tried to convince me my mind or my choices were too delicate to be trusted." She looked back at Nathaniel, something almost gentle in her refusal now that the certainty had fully settled. "I am sorry for the pain this causes you, Nathaniel. I do not say any of this to be cruel, but I will not spend one more moment of my life pretending I might still choose the path you want for me. That woman left Boston 11 weeks ago, and she is not coming back." Nathaniel stood there a long moment, the bouquet still extended, uncertain. Now what to do with it, his careful composure entirely dismantled. "You'll regret this," he said finally, though the words carried more desperation than conviction. "Frontier life will wear you down eventually, Sarah. It always does for women like you." "Perhaps," Sarah said. "But it will be my regret to bear born of my own choice, rather than a lifetime of comfort I never actually wanted." She stepped past him, then crossing the platform to where Jed stood waiting, and neither of them looked back to see whether Nathaniel remained standing there or found his own way toward the return train. "You came back," Jed said when she finally stood in front of him close enough to touch. "I told you I would. Feared that might change once you were back among all that comfort. Fancy houses, fancy manners, a man offering you a whole different kind of life." Sarah reached up, touched his face the way she had on the platform months of separation ago, her eyes bright and certain. "I have spent my whole life," she said softly, "surrounded by people who mistook comfort for happiness and wealth for worth. It took leaving all of it behind to understand the difference. And it took you, Jed Colter, sitting in a child's desk with chalk dust on your hands, teaching yourself to believe you were worth the effort it took, watching that, to understand exactly what kind of life I actually wanted to build." He kissed her then, right there on the platform, in full view of the whole town that had gathered curious and hopeful to watch the schoolteacher come home. Behind them, unnoticed by either Nathaniel Ashford, climbed back aboard the very train he'd arrived on his expensive bouquet, abandoned on a platform bench already gone from Copper Hollow, and from both their lives, by the time the whistle sounded its departure. Jed pulled back just far enough to look at her properly. 39 years of learned silence finally fully broken open into something he'd never once imagined himself capable of feeling this certain about. "Marry me," he said. "Not next month, not next year, once things settle proper. Now, Sarah, soon as the Reverend's got a free evening. I've spent too many years already not saying the things I meant. Don't aim to waste one more day of it." Sarah's eyes filled her hands, finding his steady and sure. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Jed. 1,000 times yes." The news moved through Copper Hollow faster than any fire ever could, and by the following morning, half the town seemed to already know that Jedediah Colter and Sarah Langford intended to marry before the month was out. Otis Pruitt, to his credit, said nothing mocking about it this time. He simply nodded when Jed came in for supplies and set aside a bolt of good blue cloth he thought Sarah might favor refusing payment for it with a gruffness that passed in Otis's limited vocabulary for an apology still being paid off in installments. "Widow Hutchins is already talking about baking." Ezra reported, grinning wide as he helped Jed muck out the stalls that afternoon, an errand that had become an excuse for conversation more than actual work. "Woman hasn't been that stirred up since her granddaughter's wedding. Says she means to make enough pie to feed the whole valley twice over. Ain't asked her to do any such thing. Didn't need asking, son. This whole town's been starving for something good to celebrate after all the ugliness with Whitlock. You and Miss Langford, you're about the best excuse for joy this valley's had in years." Jed paused his work, leaning on the pitchfork a moment. Something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest at the thought not just of marrying Sarah, though that alone still struck him breathless most mornings when he woke and remembered it was true, but of being for once in his life a source of something good in this town, rather than an object of its quiet cruelty. "Never thought I'd live to see the day this valley celebrated anything on my account," he said. "Times change, Jed, mostly on account of men brave enough to change first." Ezra clapped him on the shoulder. "You go on and see the Reverend. Man's been asking after you since word got round." Reverend Hale received them in his small study behind the church, the same church where Jed had once fled mid-service, rather than admit he couldn't read a single verse. And something about sitting there now, Sarah's hand in his, felt like closing a circle that had been left open far too long. "I'll not pretend I haven't heard the talk," Reverend Hale said, settling into his chair with the careful diplomacy of a man accustomed to navigating a small town's opinions. "Some in this congregation still whisper about propriety about a courtship that began with evening lessons behind closed doors." Sarah's spine straightened, old defensiveness rising fast, but Jed's hand found hers before she could speak. "Let them whisper," Jed said, steady and unbothered in a way that would have been impossible for him a few months earlier. "We got nothing to hide from Reverend. Everything that happened between us happened in the open, whatever folks choose to imagine otherwise. I'd stand up in front of this whole congregation and say so plain if that's what's needed." Reverend Hale studied him a long moment, something like respect moving across his weathered face. "Won't be necessary," the Reverend said finally. "I've watched this town's opinion of you shift a great deal these past months, Jedediah. Watched you walk into that schoolhouse ashamed and walk out of a courtroom with your head held high. A man doesn't make that journey without real substance behind it." He smiled, warm now, genuine. "I'd be honored to marry the two of you. Might I suggest 3 weeks from Sunday? Gives the town proper time to prepare and gives you both a chance to breathe after everything you've weathered this past season." 3 weeks sounds a lifetime, Jed admitted, "but I reckon we've waited longer for worse things." Sarah laughed, bright and unguarded, and Jed found himself smiling at the sound of it, still faintly amazed that he'd become a man capable of making her laugh at all. The trouble, when it came, arrived exactly 9 days before the wedding in the form of a formal letter delivered by the county sheriff himself, carrying news that landed like a fresh blow to a wound Jed had thought fully healed. Duke Marsh's testimonies led to a deeper look into the Whitlock estate's old records, the sheriff explained, standing awkward in Jed's yard, clearly uncomfortable, delivering news he knew wouldn't be welcome. "Found something in the process that concerns your property directly, Colter. Figured you'd best hear it from me before Whitlock's lawyer tries using it against you." "What kind of something?" "Old debt record. Says your father borrowed against a portion of Colter Ridge back in '71 from Whitlock's own father, old Josiah Whitlock. Debt was never marked paid in the county ledger. If it's legitimate and unpaid, it could give the Whitlock estate a legal claim on a portion of your land, including, potentially, the very water rights you just won back. Jed's stomach dropped straight through the floor. That can't be right. My father never borrowed a thing from any Whitlock, living or dead. Man would have sooner starved. Might be true. Might also be a forgery cooked up quick by Whitlock's lawyer, desperate for any last angle to salvage something out of this whole mess, before formal charges close in on him for good. The sheriff's face was grim. Either way, it's filed with the county now. And there's a hearing set to review it 6 days from today, Colter, 3 days before your wedding if the date holds. Jed stood in his own yard, the ground he'd just fought so hard to secure, suddenly uncertain beneath his feet all over again, old fear and new fury tangling together in his chest. He found Sarah at the schoolhouse that evening and told her everything. Watching her face shift from shock to a hard-focused determination he'd come to recognize as her particular way of meeting trouble head-on rather than flinching from it. "Another paper," she said quietly. "Whitlock's spent this whole fight trying to bury you in documents you couldn't read. Seems fitting he'd try one more time even with everything already crumbling around him." Except this time, Jed said something steady settling into his voice, despite the fear still churning underneath. "I can read every word of whatever they put in front of me. Whatever trick this is, I'll see it plain, same as I saw through the last one." "We'll see it together," Sarah corrected. 6 days, Jed. We've beaten worse odds in less time than that." They rode to Ezra's the following morning, and the old man's face went thoughtful and grim at the news. "Whitlock's grasping," Ezra said. "Man's facing criminal charges already on account of Duke's testimony. This debt claim's likely his lawyer's last play. Try to salvage something valuable enough to bargain his way into a lighter sentence, or at least walk away from this valley with something in his pocket besides ruin. Is there any truth to it at all? Any chance my father really did borrow against this land?" Ezra was quiet a long moment, his brow furrowed with the effort of memory. "Your father was a proud man, Jed. Wouldn't have wanted the town knowing his business if he ever had struggled enough to need Josiah Whitlock's money. But I do recall a hard winter back around then, 70-71, somewhere in there. Cattle prices dropped something fierce. Wouldn't surprise me none if plenty of ranchers in this valley found themselves borrowing from whoever had money to lend that year, Whitlock included." Jed's chest tightened. "You're saying it might be true. I'm saying I don't rightly know. But there's a way to find out for certain. County recorder keeps a full ledger of loan filings from that era, separate from the deed records. If your father truly borrowed and truly repaid, there'd be a marked notation somewhere in that ledger, even if the original debt paper itself got lost or misfiled over the years." "Then that's where we start," Sarah said, already rising. 6 days, Jed. Let's not waste a single one of them." The county recorder's office sat 2 towns over, and the ride there and back ate a full day they could scarcely spare. But by the time they arrived, dusty and anxious, the elderly clerk who managed the archive proved unexpectedly sympathetic once he understood the stakes. Colter," he murmured, running a weathered finger down page after page of faded ledger entries. The 3 of them crowded close around the counter, watching every movement of his hand with held breath. "Ah, here." Jed's heart hammered as the clerk turned the ledger toward them, and this time, for the first time in his life, Jed didn't need anyone else to read the entry for him. Amos Colter loan of $340 secured against North Pasture acreage, dated March 1871. Repaid in full October 1873. Notation: paid witnessed by county clerk. Repaid. Jed said, his voice cracking with disbelief and relief tangled together. Paid in full near 60 years, no near a full decade before I was even old enough to understand what debt meant. There it is, plain as day, the clerk confirmed, tapping the entry. Any claim suggesting this debt remains outstanding would be directly contradicted by the county's own official record. I'd be glad to provide a certified copy for your hearing if it helps your case any." "It helps a great deal," Sarah said, relief flooding her voice. "Thank you, truly." They rode back to Copper Hollow well after dark, exhausted but triumphant Jed, clutching the certified copy of the ledger entry like it might vanish if he loosened his grip even slightly. The hearing, when it came, proved almost anticlimactic compared to the desperate scramble that had preceded it. Whitlock's lawyer, a different man this time, hastily retained, clearly aware his client's reputation and resources had crumbled too far for Cyrus Beadle to bother returning, presented the forged debt document with visibly diminished confidence. Jed's young attorney, considerably more assured now after their previous victory, simply produced the certified county ledger entry, and the presiding official, not Judge Voss this time, but a county magistrate handling the smaller claim, dismissed the matter within the hour, noting for the record his suspicion that the debt document itself bore signs of recent forgery, a suspicion that would only add further weight to the criminal case already building against Silas Whitlock. "Man's finished," Ezra said with satisfaction as they left the courthouse for what Jed sincerely hoped was the final time. "Word is, the county's set to formally charge him within the week. Evidence tampering, witness intimidation, now attempted fraud on top of it. Even his money won't buy him clear of all that." Jed felt something loosen in his chest that had been coiled tight since the sheriff first delivered that unsettling news 9 days earlier. 3 days, he said, looking at Sarah, disbelief and joy finally allowed to surface fully now that the last obstacle had crumbled behind them. 3 days, and no more papers standing between us and Sunday. But paper, it seemed, wasn't quite finished testing them yet, though this time the document that arrived carried an entirely different weight. The letter came from Boston, addressed to Sarah, in the careful hand of a lawyer's clerk, and she opened it at the schoolhouse desk with hands that trembled slightly, old grief and old fear resurfacing at the sight of the familiar formal script. She read it in silence, her face shifting through several emotions Jed couldn't quite name, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "My father's will," she said, formally read and finalized. "He's left me an inheritance, Jed, a substantial one." She paused, something conflicted moving across her face. "But there's a condition attached. The lawyer writes that my father's original will, drafted years ago, specified the inheritance was contingent upon my marriage to Nathaniel Ashford, specifically a condition apparently still legally binding unless amended." Jed's stomach tightened. "And was it amended?" Sarah's hands shook slightly as she turned to the second page of the letter. "There's a codicil," she said, slowly reading carefully now, "added in my father's own hand, dated just 2 days before he died. The lawyer says he insisted on dictating it personally over some protest from his own counsel." She read further, her voice growing thick. "He struck the marriage condition entirely, Jed. Wrote instead that the inheritance passes to me, quote, without condition or restriction, in recognition that my daughter's judgment regarding her own happiness has proven, in the end, wiser than my own ever was." Her voice broke on the final words, and Jed crossed the room fast, gathering her into his arms as the grief and relief finally overtook her all at once. "He believed in you," Jed said softly, even if it took him dying to say so plain. "He apologized," Sarah said, muffled against his shoulder, tears finally falling freely now. "In his own way, in the only way a man like my father knew how, through legal language and formal codicils, rather than words spoken face to face. But he apologized, Jed. And I never thought I'd hear that from him, not in this life." They stood together a long while, and when Sarah finally pulled back, something had settled and healed in her that had been raw since the moment she'd first left Boston. "I don't need the inheritance," she said, wiping her eyes, something clear and certain returning to her voice. "I've built a life here that has nothing to do with Boston money, but I'll not refuse it either, not when it comes freely without condition, as proof that my father finally saw me clearly before the end." "Use it however you see fit," Jed said. Might do a world of good for the reading room if you're of a mind, or the school. Whatever you believe this valley needs most. Sarah looked at him, something bright and grateful in her expression. I rather think, she said, we'll decide that together, same as everything else we've built. The final days before the wedding passed in a blur of small, meaningful moments that Jed found himself wanting to hold on to individually, each one precious after so many months of fear and struggle. The reading room held its regular Thursday evening session, and this time one of the youngest students, a nervous young ranch hand named Caleb, who'd struggled through every lesson with visible frustration, stood up unprompted and read haltingly, but completely, an entire passage from the primer Sarah had assigned, his voice shaking with pride, rather than fear, by the final line. The small room erupted into applause, the other students pounding the desks in celebration, and Jed watched from the back with a lump in his throat, recognizing in Caleb's shy, disbelieving smile the exact same disbelief he'd felt himself reading his own name for the first time in that empty schoolhouse months earlier. Feels good, don't it? Jed said afterward, clapping the young man on the shoulder. Feels like I finally got something nobody can take from me, Caleb said, still glowing with pride. Heard what you did, Mr. Colter, fighting Whitlock in that courtroom, reading your own father's deed right out loud. Figured if a grown man could do that, wasn't no reason I couldn't learn my letters too. Weren't nothing special about me, Jed said. Just a man too stubborn to keep hiding. Maybe so, Caleb said. But stubborn's a fine thing to learn from all the same. 2 days before the wedding, Widow Hutchins arrived at Colter Ridge with an entire wagon bed full of pies and preserves, insisting on personally overseeing preparations for what she'd apparently decided, without consulting anyone, would be the finest wedding celebration Copper Hollow had witnessed in a generation. Your mother would be proud, you know, she said to Jed, catching him alone for a moment while Sarah helped arrange chairs borrowed from half the town. I knew her briefly before she passed. Fine woman. Would have been right pleased to see the man you've become. Jed felt something tighten in his throat at the mention of a mother he barely remembered. Wish I could recall more of her. She'd have taught you your letters herself, I expect, had she lived long enough, Widow Hutchins said gently. Your father never was much good with book learning himself, truth told, though he never much wanted anyone knowing that either. Grief does strange things to a man's pride, Jed. I expect he simply didn't know how to give you what he'd never quite mastered himself, and told himself it didn't matter rather than admit his own limits. The revelation landed soft but significant in Jed's chest. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. A crack of light into 30 years of believing. His father's harsh words had been simple cruelty rather than a grieving. Limited man's own shame projected outward onto his son. Never thought of it that way, Jed admitted quietly. Most children don't until they're grown enough themselves to understand how heavy a parent's own fears can weigh on everything they pass down, Widow Hutchins said. You broke that chain, Jed Colter. Whatever your father couldn't give you, you found the courage to claim for yourself anyway, and you're fixing to pass something entirely different down to whatever children you and Miss Langford raised together. That's no small thing. Ciao. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and warm, the whole town of Copper Hollow, gathering at the little church well before the appointed hour. More people crowded into those pews than Jed had ever seen there before, even accounting for every Sunday he'd once sat alone and ashamed in the back row. He stood at the front now, in his one good shirt, pressed carefully the night before by his own hand, watching the door with a nervous anticipation that had nothing to do with fear anymore, and everything to do with pure, uncomplicated joy. Ezra stood beside him, as best man, grinning wide enough to nearly split his weathered face in two. Never thought I'd see this day, the old man murmured. Watching Amos Colter's boy stand up here about to marry the finest woman this valley's ever known. Neither did I, Jed admitted. Not for the longest time. The music started Widow Hutchins herself at an old piano dragged specially into the church for the occasion, and the doors opened and Sarah stepped through them in a simple blue dress that Jed would remember for the rest of his life as the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Her face radiant, her eyes finding his immediately, and holding there the entire slow walk up the aisle. Reverend Hale's ceremony was simple and heartfelt, and when the moment came for vows, Jed reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded piece of paper, his hands steady despite the weight of what it represented. "I wrote something down," he said, his voice carrying clear through the hushed church. "First time in my life I ever wrote my own vows on paper, instead of just carrying words around in my head, afraid to trust them to anything permanent. Figured this occasion deserved better than that." He unfolded the paper carefully and began to read, his voice steady, his letters still imperfect, still bearing the careful, deliberate shape of a man who'd learned them late, carrying every word exactly as he'd intended them. Sarah Langford. 6 months ago, I couldn't read my own name, and I believed deep down that meant something true and permanent about what I was worth. You never once let me believe that lie, not for a single evening we sat together in that schoolhouse. You taught me my letters, but more than that, you taught me that a man's worth ain't measured by what he lacks, but by the courage he's got to change it. I promise you, standing here today, that I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the faith you had in me, before I had any faith in myself. I promise to keep learning alongside you, whatever comes, letters, or love, or whatever hard lessons life's still got waiting for us. And I promise you'll never again have to fight alone for anything, not while I've got breath left in me to stand beside you." The church had gone entirely silent, half the congregation wiping at their eyes, and Sarah stood before him with tears streaming freely down her face, unashamed, radiant with a joy that needed no further words to explain itself. "Jed Colter," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "I came to this valley believing I was running from a life that didn't fit me, searching for something I couldn't yet name. I found it in you, not a rescue, not a man who needed saving, but a partner brave enough to fight for his own worth, and generous enough to teach that same courage to every soul in this valley who needed it. I promise to keep believing in you on the days you struggle to believe in yourself. I promise to keep fighting beside you whatever comes. And I promise that wherever we build our life together, it will always be a place where courage matters more than what a person lacks." Reverend Hale, his own eyes suspiciously bright, pronounced them husband and wife, and the church erupted into joyful noise, the whole congregation rising as one, and Jed kissed his wife for the first time in front of the entire town that had once mocked him, now celebrating him without a single trace of the old cruelty that had once defined so much of his life here. The celebration that followed stretched long into the warm summer evening. Tables set up outside the church, groaning under the weight of Widow Hutchins' pies, and half the valley's contributed dishes, fiddles and laughter carrying across Copper Hollow, in a way that felt to Jed like the whole town finally exhaling after months of tension and fear. He found himself at one point standing near the edge of the celebration, with Ezra watching Sarah laugh with a cluster of well-wishers, still hardly able to believe the life unfolding in front of him. "Sheriff came by this afternoon before the ceremony," Ezra said quietly when they had a private moment. "Thought you'd want to know rather than have it spoil your day if it came up in front of everybody. Silas Whitlock's been formally charged, multiple counts. Word is he's already selling off what remains of his property to cover legal fees, what little the county hasn't already frozen pending trial." Jed absorbed that news with a strange quiet calm, none of the old fury it might once have stirred in him. "Man lost everything," Jed said, trying to steal something that was never his to take in the first place. "Seems a fitting enough lesson," Ezra agreed, though I doubt he's learned much from it, proud as he's always been. "Not my concern anymore," Jed said, and found to his own quiet satisfaction that he genuinely meant it. "Got better things to spend my thoughts on now." He looked back toward Sarah, who caught his eye across the celebration, and smiled, something warm and certain passing between them, even across the distance, and Jed felt the last remnants of old bitterness toward Whitlock simply dissolve, replaced entirely by the fullness of everything he'd built instead. Months passed the way they always do, faster than a person expects when happiness fills the space where fear used to live. The reading room grew steadily, word spreading through neighboring valleys, until Jed and Sarah found themselves some evenings teaching a room crowded with more than a dozen grown men and women alike, all of them finding in that small converted bunkhouse a courage they'd once believed themselves too old or too broken to claim. Sarah used a portion of her father's inheritance exactly as she'd promised to build a proper schoolhouse addition specifically for adult students, separate from the children's classroom, with real desks sized for grown bodies and a small library of books that grew with every passing season. Caleb, the young ranch hand who'd first stood up trembling to read his lesson aloud, eventually became one of the reading room's regular volunteer teachers, himself passing along to newer students the same patient encouragement he'd once received. And Jed Colter, once the man who fled church mid-service, rather than admit he couldn't read a single verse, found himself one ordinary Sunday morning, nearly a year after that first humiliating hearing, called upon once more by a visiting preacher to read scripture aloud to the congregation. This time he didn't hesitate. This time he didn't feel his stomach drop or his hands begin to shake. He simply stood, walked to the front of the church without a trace of the old fear, and read the passage clear and steady, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room, his wife watching from the front pew, with tears of pride shining in her eyes. When he finished and returned to his seat, an old rancher 2 pews back, a man who'd once laughed along with Duke Marsh's cruelty outside the general store, leaned forward and clasped Jed's shoulder with quiet, genuine respect. "Proud to know you, Colter," the man said simply. Jed nodded, accepting the words, without the old shame that would once have made such simple kindness feel unbearable. He thought in that quiet moment of his father, of a hard-grieving man who'd never found the courage to admit his own limits, who'd passed down silence and shame instead of patience and truth, believing wrongly that some men simply weren't meant for letters, weren't meant for anything beyond the narrow life they'd been handed. He thought of the burned map, the single surviving corner of his father's careful hand reaching across a decade to offer one imperfect but genuine gift. And he understood finally and completely that his father had been wrong about nearly everything except one thing: that a person's worth was never fixed, never permanent, never something written once and left unchangeable. It was something built one hard, deliberate choice at a time by anyone brave enough to stop believing the lies told about them and start proving instead exactly who they were capable of becoming. Jedediah Colter, who had once sat alone and ashamed in the back row of that very church, unable to read a single word placed before him, walked out into the bright Montana sunshine that Sunday, with his wife's hand in his, a reading room full of students waiting for him back at Colter Ridge, and a truth settled permanently in his chest that no fire, no forged document, and no cruel word from any man could ever again take from him. A person is never measured by what they once lacked. They are measured always and only by the courage they find to change it.